Chapter 4157. It was just as Ji Tianqing had said. Half of the boundless heaven continent was now under the control of the rebel alliance. Today, Ji Tianqing had killed the commander of internal affairs and Kanglin Everlasting. It would be difficult for the imperial tutor to find another expert of the same level who he could trust and who had the ability to stand on his own. It was expected that the next attack of the rebel alliance would be unstoppable, and the imperial tutor would be helpless. When the disciples of the 5 clans thought of this, they were all excited and full of expectations. But as Ji Tianqing had said, with this lesson, they had to be more cautious and not be careless. Although the Kenshin could save them once or twice, it was impossible for them to guard them all day long and save them 3 or 4 times. If they wanted to restore the reputation of the Western Road Army and impress the people of the boundless heaven continent, they had to show their true abilities. And the most important thing was that the clans had to transfer manpower to restore the 4,000 men of the Western Road Army as soon as possible. After Ji Tianqing spoke to the crowd, he gave a few words of advice to clan leader Wanyan before he turned and left. The clan leaders, elders, and deacons watched him float away, their hearts filled with excitement and joy. They could not calm down for a long time. When Ji Tianqing flew to the exit of the secret realm, he saw hundreds of seriously injured guards of the domain chief's manor healing their wounds. The soul-shaking domain lord ignored his own injuries and personally led hundreds of guards who were less injured to repair the grand formation at the exit. Noticing Ji Tianqing's arrival, the soul-shaking region's master and the guards hurriedly stopped casting and bowed respectfully. Ji Tianqing glanced at the domain chief and nodded slightly. "You're not bad. Keep working hard and don't let me down." After saying this, he left without looking back. But the domain chief was stunned in place, his face full of surprise and pride. A moment later, Ji Tianqing had already left the domain chief and disappeared into the sky. Only then did the domain chief come back to his senses. He pointed at himself proudly and said excitedly, "Did you see that? Kenshin. Kenshin spoke to me alone just now. He praised and encouraged me. Ha ha ha. Kenshin will remember me." The soul-shaking domain lord, who had always been solemn and dignified, was now as happy as a child. He was so excited that it was as if he had won a heaven-shaking prize. However, the guards beside him did not feel strange or awkward. They all nodded in agreement as they felt the same way. They were also a little excited as they exclaimed and praised him. "The domain lord is going to soar. This means that His Excellency's heroic performance has caught the eye of Kenshin. The region lord is mighty." To be able to obtain Kenshin's recognition and praise is definitely something that countless experts dream of. Although they knew that the guards were flattering him, they were also excited, envious, and amazed from the bottom of their hearts. Therefore, the soul-shaking domain lord was very happy and felt that the risk he had taken was worth it. After Ji Tianqing left the soul-shaking domain, he boarded the Godslayer battleship and rushed back to meet up with the Northern Army. At this time, his clone was still leading the Northern Army and was still conquering one region after another. Anyway, his clone also had the strength of a peak divine king. No one could tell if it was real or fake. Moreover, wherever the Northern Army went, those domain lords could not help but surrender when they heard the name of Kenshin. Who would dare to resist? 4 days later, Ji Tianqing met up with the Northern Army and withdrew his clone. Everything returned to normal. The Rebel Alliance's expansion did not stop. At this time, the news of the 8,000 Western punitive army besieging the Western Army but being completely annihilated by Kenshin in the soul-shaking secret realm spread again. This kind of major event and war was already very eye-catching. In addition, the Sword God had personally made a move, appearing and disappearing like a ghost. He had miraculously annihilated 8,000 soldiers of the Western punitive expedition, causing a huge commotion. For a time, the various regions of the boundless heaven continent were discussing and praising this matter. Not only the top powerhouses and factions, but even the hundreds of millions of civilians knew that Kenshin had once again created a miracle. As the related news spread, the cause, process, and twists of the matter were all restored. When the people of the boundless heaven continent knew about Kenshin's intentions and plans, they could not help but praise and respect him. At the same time, there was also a very influential rumor circulating on the continent. Kenshin has figured out the imperial tutor's nature and thoughts. He can already predict the future and guess the imperial tutor's movements and plans. In addition, the Rebel Alliance has taken over half of the continent. Kenshin's strength is also unparalleled. They are invincible below the 5 god emperors. Obviously, Kenshin has completely grasped the initiative and the advantage. The imperial tutor is helpless and can only wait for his death. This rumor was the conclusion of some top powerhouses and divine kings based on what happened in the past 6 months. And this conclusion received the support and affirmation of hundreds of millions of people. At least 80% of the people on the boundless heaven continent were certain that the Rebel Alliance would win for sure. Kenshin would definitely unify the entire continent. The imperial tutor would definitely be defeated, and the speed would be very fast. Perhaps it would be soon. Similar rumors spread wildly on the boundless heaven continent, causing everyone to know about it. Therefore, the territories and civilians that had already belonged to the Rebel Alliance were naturally overjoyed and full of anticipation. The other half had not been subdued and was still under the control of the imperial tutor. It was a bleak and depressing scene. Even the tens of thousands of soldiers stationed in the Dark Knight domain became demoralized and dispirited. There were even deserters among the soldiers. Some soldiers quietly left the troops and disappeared without a trace. There were not many of these soldiers. They were divided into countless small teams, and their strength was more scattered. After they fled the Dark Knight domain, it was impossible for them to join the Rebel Alliance. But in their view, if they could leave the army under the imperial tutor as soon as possible, they could also save their lives in the future. Unknowingly, another month had passed. The development of the matter was just like the rumors circulating in the boundless heaven continent. The 5 clans of the Western Army transferred many of their disciples and recovered to 4,000 people. The Rebel Alliance's power did not weaken. Instead, its prestige increased. The 4 armies rushed about non-stop, successively subduing one territory after another. Today, 64 territories had already been subdued by the Rebel Alliance and were under the command of the Kenshin. Most of the territorial masters of these territories had joined the Rebel Alliance and also swore to be loyal to the Kenshin. Only a dozen or so territories had territorial masters who rebelled and were killed by the Rebel Alliance, and a new territorial master was chosen. Or, when the imperial tutor issued the order to assemble, those territorial masters rushed to the Dark Knight domain and gave up their territories. At this time, the Rebel Alliance could be said to be at the peak of its power, and victory was in their grasp. The imperial tutor's faction was suppressed to the point of being unable to breathe. The morale of the army was slack, and the territories were constantly shrinking. Finally, the more than 300 god kings and god generals under the imperial tutor could no longer sit still. Chapter 4158. In the past month, there had been constant rumors on the boundless heaven continent, and the situation had been worsening. The Rebel Alliance had won successive victories, and their reputation soared. Naturally, the tens of thousands of soldiers under the imperial tutor were holed up in the Dark Knight domain. Although it was said that they were waiting for an opportunity, it felt more like they were waiting for death. The morale of the army was low, and more soldiers were running away. The 300 divine kings and generals were worried, but they could not come up with a good plan. Helpless, they gathered together to discuss countermeasures, and finally unanimously decided to meet the imperial tutor. No matter how the outside world described Kenshin as brilliant and unparalleled, and how stupid and stubborn the imperial tutor was described as, in the hearts of these generals and divine kings, the imperial tutor was still their pillar of support for victory and survival. Late at night, the imperial tutor was in his residence as usual, cultivating in the secret chamber. Ever since he learned of a certain secret a few months ago, he had changed from a state of nervousness and anxiety to one of confidence, certainty, and leisure. No one knew why he was so confident and relaxed, and he had never explained the reason to anyone. At this moment, the guard outside the secret chamber reported loudly, "Lord Imperial Tutor, 12 great generals request an audience, and they are waiting for you in the study." The imperial tutor had more than 300 divine kings and divine generals under his command, but it was impossible for all of them to meet the imperial tutor. Therefore, they chose 12 divine generals and experts who had the highest status and were the most respectable. The imperial tutor was displeased that his cultivation was interrupted. He frowned and asked in a low voice, "I did not order them to gather for a meeting. What do they want?" The guard outside the door quickly replied, "Lord Imperial Tutor, they are indeed not here on orders, but they said that they have something important to discuss with you." The Imperial Tutor frowned and thought for a moment. He guessed the intentions of the 12 divine generals and divine kings, and could not help but feel displeased. Chimpage. These impatient fellows, how can they achieve great things if they are so impatient and rash after such a small setback? The Imperial Tutor cursed in his heart, and he felt a little sad. In the past, he had a few experts who were shrewd enough to accomplish great things and take charge of a region. But now, those experts had been killed by Kenshin, so he had no one to use under his command. With a sorrowful heart, the Imperial Tutor got up and left the secret chamber, hurrying to the study. A moment later, when he entered the study, he saw the 12 divine generals waiting for him in the study. These god generals were all high-level god kings. Some were commanders of a region, while others were leaders of primordial clans or peak forces. Although each of them had different appearances, their auras were very majestic, and their strength was not ordinary. Seeing the Imperial Tutor enter the study, everyone bowed in unison and said in unison, "Greetings, Imperial Tutor." The Imperial Tutor nodded slightly and walked to the throne expressionlessly. He calmly swept his gaze across the crowd and asked in a dignified tone, "What? After hearing some rumors and criticism outside, you can't keep your cool anymore?" The 12 god generals were stunned by the question. After looking at each other, someone immediately stepped forward and remonstrated. "Lord Imperial Tutor, we have indeed heard some rumors and criticism. However, those rumors have been circulating for a month, and everyone on the continent knows about it. Moreover, the criticism and slander among the people have caused great harm and humiliation to you. As the saying goes, if the master is humiliated, the servant will die. You are magnanimous and did not argue with the ants, but we cannot sit by and do nothing." Another immortal general also took a step forward, bowed and reported, "Lord Imperial Preceptor, if it's just rumors and slander from the outside world, we can just ignore them. An eagle naturally won't care about the ridicule of an ant. However, the entire boundless heaven continent is filled with such rumors, and the direction of the wind and the situation are all controlled by Kenshin. Now, our army's morale has been greatly affected, and the soldiers are all depressed and anxious. To tell you the truth, for the past month, the daily headcount has revealed that there are soldiers from various divisions who have fled." The third god general followed up and said, "Lord Imperial Tutor, a 1,000-mile dam can be destroyed by an ant's nest. You should know this better than us. If we don't think of a way to stabilize our army's morale, I'm afraid that before the 4 armies of Kenshin arrive, the soldiers will collapse without a fight. After all, those ordinary soldiers are definitely not as calm and confident as you." Following that, a few more god generals also spoke up to persuade the Imperial Tutor that it was time to take action and express his opinion. However, the Imperial Tutor listened quietly and did not express his opinion. After everyone had said what they needed to say and the study fell into silence, he slowly opened his mouth and said, "Are you done saying what you want to say? Is there anyone else who wants to add?" The god generals looked at each other and did not say anything. The Imperial Tutor's attitude made them feel uneasy. They were all worried that the goal of this trip would be difficult to achieve. As expected, the Imperial Tutor looked at them from the corner of his eyes and sipped his tea unhurriedly. He said, "You guys have been rambling about so much. It sounds like you have a good reason and the situation is very tense. However, in reality, do you think that you can hide your thoughts from me? Isn't what you really want to know the reason why I'm so fearless?" These few words poked at the god general's thoughts and caused their expressions to change slightly. However, 2 of the god generals reacted quickly and hurriedly bowed and explained, "Lord Imperial Preceptor is indeed wise and mighty, unparalleled in the world. Nothing can escape your eyes. However, we all know and believe that you have enough confidence and means to annihilate the Kenshin. However, the tens of thousands of soldiers under your command are stupid and do not know this. Lord, of course we believe in you. including the 300 generals and god kings, we also have great confidence in you. However, no matter how hard we tried, we could not pacify the soldiers under your command. If we can't pacify the soldiers, they will not stop running away. Simply put, these god generals had their thoughts exposed by the imperial tutor and openly admitted it. They then shifted the blame to the soldiers and cleared themselves of all responsibility. The imperial tutor did not bother to expose them or reprimand them. He looked up and scanned the crowd. He saw that all the god generals were looking at him with burning eyes and full of anticipation. He knew that these god generals would not give up until they achieved their goal. Moreover, as the commander-in-chief, he had to consider the big picture. After hiding it for so long, it was time to let the generals know something to calm them down. Thus, the corners of the imperial preceptor's mouth curled up into a playful smile. He stroked his beard and asked everyone, "Right now, the sword god is in the limelight. His reputation is monstrous. The outside world is spreading rumors about how he is full of schemes, how powerful he is, and how he is unrivaled in the world. However, in reality, is he really invincible? Is his scheme really unbreakable and impossible to guard against? No. Let me tell you, in front of absolute power, his strength and schemes will become the biggest joke." Chapter 4159. In the end, the imperial tutor still did not clearly state what the trump card he was relying on for his confidence was. However, the 12 divine generals were not fools. From the imperial tutor's words, they had also caught some clues and vaguely guessed the answer. Kenshin was powerful enough, and his schemes and shrewdness were also deep enough. However, the imperial tutor said that in the face of absolute power, Kenshin was a joke. Then, who could compare to Kenshin in terms of absolute power? The answer was obvious. Thus, after the 12 divine generals guessed the answer, they all felt relieved. After chatting with the imperial tutor and discussing some minor matters, they all bowed and bade farewell, turning to leave the study. Of course, before the 12 divine generals left, the imperial tutor solemnly warned them. No matter what, they could not reveal this secret. The 12 divine generals naturally obeyed and expressed that they would not leak this secret. A few days later, the 12 divine generals commanded more than 300 generals to suppress and restrain the tens of thousands of soldiers under their command. After the strict military orders were passed down, the soldiers' discussions clearly decreased. Most of the negative, neglectful, and pessimistic emotions were also eliminated, and their morale had also clearly increased. Of course, these changes were all achieved under the 12 divine generals' unyielding orders. The answer they had guessed was not revealed to anyone. Even the 300 divine kings and generals did not know, let alone the tens of thousands of soldiers. As a result, there were still a small number of soldiers who were pessimistic and worried about the future. They did not believe that the imperial tutor had any hope of defeating Kenshin. Every day, some soldiers would still quietly escape, but the number was much lower than before. Every day, there were still soldiers discussing the situation in private and spreading the news of the rebel alliance's triumphant advance. However, the soldiers all suppressed it and did not dare to spread it widely, only discussing it in private. The 4 armies of the rebel alliance were as aggressive as ever, flattening everything in their path. The imperial tutor did not clearly state his position and was clearly in a passive state, with almost no one he could use. The entire boundless heaven continent's forces and powerhouses all saw it clearly. Everyone believed that the imperial tutor was determined to defend the Dark Knight domain and fight a final battle with the rebel alliance. In that case, before the final battle, the imperial tutor faction would not be able to fight back. Since that was the case, there was no need for the domain lords to resist. Everyone had the same mentality. Since the Rebel Alliance's army had arrived, they would first surrender to the Rebel Alliance and pledge their allegiance to the Kenshin. In any case, the Imperial Tutor doesn't care if we live or die, so there's no need to talk about loyalty. In the end, when the Imperial Tutor fought the Rebel Alliance, we would stand by and not interfere. If the Rebel Alliance wins, we will be safe. If the Rebel Alliance is defeated and the Imperial Tutor wins, we can say that we were forced into a corner. In short, these domain lords did not feel guilty. They were just waiting to see the results of the final battle. The four armies of the Rebel Alliance did not disappoint the people of the boundless heaven continent. In the next 4 months, almost every 2 or 3 days, there would be news of victory from one of the armies, announcing that a certain domain had been subdued. Of course, there were only about 40 domains left that had not yet surrendered to the Rebel Alliance. Among them, there were more than 20 domain lords who were loyal to the Imperial Tutor and the Azura God Emperor. As early as a few months ago, when the Imperial Tutor ordered them to gather at the Dark Knight domain, they had already been ordered to rush to the Dark Knight domain. Their respective domains were in a state of emptiness and no one was defending them. Whichever army of the Rebel Alliance arrived, it was directly subdued. In fact, many forces that took advantage of the situation emerged in the domains abandoned by the domain lords. Every domain had a few top or first-tier forces, or clans, and sects with a strong foundation. When the domain lords were in power, they could only obediently lay low due to the rule of the domain lords, the Imperial Tutor, and the Azura God Emperor. But in this turmoil, they saw an opportunity to rise. When they learned that the Rebel Alliance's army was about to arrive, the first-tier forces, clans, and sects of these domains actually expressed their welcome and surrender to the Rebel Alliance in advance. They were very willing to join the Rebel Alliance and swear to the Rebel Alliance that they were loyal to the Kenshin. The reason why they did this was very simple. It was to gain the recognition of the Rebel Alliance and the Kenshin and choose them as the new domain lords. After all, the Rebel Alliance had always done this. If any domain's domain lord fled or if the domain lord resisted stubbornly and was killed, the Rebel Alliance would elect a new domain lord after subduing the domain. The newly elected domain lord did not need to be very strong, nor did they need to be very scheming and shrewd. The most important thing was that they had to be obedient and absolutely loyal to the Rebel Alliance and the Kenshin. This was not a difficult task for many forces, clans, and sects. And reality proved that the Rebel Alliance was very pleased with these smart and obedient forces. In the beginning, the first-tier forces of each domain who were the first to surrender and swear loyalty to the Rebel Alliance would be recognized and appointed as the new domain lords by the Rebel Alliance. Later on, when the news spread, it caused many regions to follow suit. In those domains that were abandoned by the domain lords and had no power, 3 or 4 forces actually appeared and surrendered to the Rebel Alliance at the same time and declared their loyalty. This made people not know whether to laugh or cry. The Rebel Alliance's army could not refuse the allegiance of several forces, so they could only choose the most suitable one to be the new domain lord. Later on, something even more laughable happened. The domain lord of a certain domain was still there, but several forces of that domain secretly contacted the Rebel Alliance's army and surrendered to the Rebel Alliance. Their attitudes were very sincere and they swore to join the Rebel Alliance. They looked like they wanted the Rebel Alliance to immediately take out the oath of surrender. They did not hesitate and immediately read it out. This made the Rebel Alliance feel a little awkward, so they could only tactfully refuse their allegiance. But they insisted that the domain lord of that domain was hesitant and not decisive enough. It was obvious that he was not loyal to the Kenshin. But they were absolutely loyal to the Kenshin and would not have any doubts or reservations. If they were appointed as domain lords, they would do their best and carry out every order of the Kenshin. This series of actions made the Rebel Alliance's people dumbfounded. They could not help but exclaim that these people were really shameless. In order to fight for the position of domain lord, they did not even care about integrity. After the matter, the domain lord of that domain naturally surrendered to the Rebel Alliance. But after the news of several forces surrendering secretly spread, the domain lord was also very embarrassed and criticized. Thus, in order to restore his reputation, the domain lord could only restore the freedom of the people as quickly as possible. Moreover, he earnestly carried out the Rebel Alliance's orders and became more diligent and caring for the people. Chapter 4160. Unknowingly, 4 lively and noisy months had passed. In these 4 months, the Rebel Alliance was the well-deserved protagonist, leading the tide and dominating the boundless heaven continent. It was the main topic of discussion among millions of people every day. The people of the entire boundless heaven continent were praising the merits of the Rebel Alliance, and the courage and love of the cowardly Kenshin. After the people of the various regions that had long been ruled by the Rebel Alliance regained their freedom, Not only did they take the initiative to destroy the statues of the Shura god emperor and the region lord, they also spontaneously built countless shrines to worship the sword god and created many exquisite statues of the sword god. Logically speaking, they had been oppressed for 1,000 years and had to work as coolies to plunder cultivation resources. They were forced to believe in the Shura god emperor and provide the power of pious faith. Now that they had finally regained their freedom, they hated worshipping statues, and even more hated worshipping and praying on time. However, the people worshipped and were grateful to Kenshin from the bottom of their hearts. The construction of the temples and statues was voluntary. Even the large-scale worship and blessing ceremonies were organized by the people spontaneously. They held all kinds of ceremonies mainly to thank Kenshin for saving them, and also to pray for Kenshin, hoping that Kenshin would live as long as the heavens and never be obliterated. Only in this way could Kenshin protect the people forever. Since ancient times, the people were the simplest, most honest, and kindest. They might not understand any great principles, nor did they understand what the big picture was. They only knew that whoever oppressed, squeezed, and enslaved them was their enemy. Whoever sympathized, pitied, and saved them was their benefactor. If this benefactor was only good to them, took them to heart, and did not ask for anything from them, then this person was a great saint, a savior. There was no doubt that Ji Tianxing was such an existence in the eyes of the people. After 4 months, the Rebel Alliance's results were remarkable. 42 more regions successively returned to the Rebel Alliance and pledged loyalty to Kenshin. At this point, 95% of the entire Boundless Heaven continent's territories were all under Ji Tianxing's command. He already became the master of the Boundless Heaven continent in name and in reality. However, the Dark Knight domain and the 2 surrounding domains had yet to be conquered, so the war was not over yet. That night, the 4 armies of the Rebel Alliance merged and became 2 armies. The army led by Ji Tianxing from the north met up with the army led by Patriarch Wanyan from the west. The southern army led by Nangong Buhua met up with the eastern army led by Du Guzhon. One of the 2 armies was stationed at the border of the overlooking wind region, while the other was stationed at the border of the origin heaven region. The overlooking wind region and the Yuantian region were respectively on the left and right of the Dark Knight region, like 2 most loyal guards, firmly protecting the Dark Knight region. Even if the entire Boundless Heaven continent surrendered, these 2 regions' domain lords still resisted stubbornly to the end. At the border of the Linfeng domain, after the northern and western armies met up, Ji Tianxing personally led them. This army of more than 6,000 people was galloping through the night towards the central region of the Linfeng domain. With the experience and lessons of the past few months, even if the Rebel Alliance controlled the overall situation and victory was in sight, the soldiers did not dare to be complacent and did not lower their guard. The army's morale was still high, and they carried out their orders meticulously. On the god-slaying battleship, in Ji Tianxing's private room, he was sitting cross-legged on a prayer mat made of divine jade, quietly meditating and adjusting his breathing. But for some reason, he couldn't calm down tonight and felt a little restless. For an expert like him, such a situation rarely occurred. The previous 2 times it had occurred, it meant that his 6th sense had burst forth, and the heavens had given him some warning and premonition. Therefore, Ji Tianxing did not suspect anything and immediately realized that some kind of danger was about to appear. He thought to himself, it has been exactly a year since the alliance was established. I have now conquered 97 domains, and only 3 are left. If I can successfully conquer these 3 domains and defeat the Imperial Tutor, it will be at least a year earlier than I originally expected. However, the Imperial Tutor has been too low-key in the past few months. If he didn't have any trump cards to rely on, he definitely wouldn't have waited for death in the face of the Rebel Alliance's aggression. Even if the experts under his command fell one after another, he would have thought of other ways to stall for time and weaken the Rebel Alliance's strength. But he didn't do anything. He just defended his base in the Dark Knight domain and watched as I killed my way to him. No one would believe that he didn't have any schemes or trump cards to rely on. Ji Tianxing thought to himself, apart from the Azura God Emperor, what other trump cards could the Imperial Tutor rely on? But the Azura God Emperor had clearly indicated that the mission of solving the mystery of the grey fog in the depths of the void was more important. He had no time to care about the lives of the imperial tutor and the others. Could it be that the Azura God Emperor will send an avatar back to support him? If that's the case, it's a normal reaction. No wonder the imperial tutor has such confidence and a trump card. However, when Ji Tianqing thought about it, he still felt that something was amiss. But even if the Azura God Emperor's avatar came back to support him, he wouldn't have enough confidence to defeat me and destroy the Rebel Alliance, right? The Azura God Emperor and the Imperial Tutor should know that I defeated several avatars of the God Emperor a few years ago. Even if the Azura God Emperor's avatar came, he wouldn't be able to defeat me. After careful consideration, a thought flashed through Ji Tianqing's mind. But he felt that this conjecture was too absurd. It shouldn't be possible, so he ruled it out. At this moment, the Wanyan clan leader's voice came from outside the secret room. Reporting to Lord Alliance Leader, we just received a message from Shemi Paradise, reporting the latest news. All the clan leaders have gathered in the conference room and are waiting for you to discuss the matter. Ji Tianqing acknowledged and let the Wanyan clan leader leave first. Then, he finished his meditation and left the secret room for the conference room. The clan leaders and sect leaders of the various forces were all present and were waiting respectfully. When they saw Ji Tianqing arrive, everyone greeted him in unison. After Ji Tianqing sat down at the head of the table, everyone sat down one after another. The Wanyan clan leader stood up, holding the message from Shemi Paradise in his hand, and announced the news to everyone. Cave Master Shemi's report was very detailed. Moreover, Shemi Paradise was the best at gathering information, so this news was also very reliable. The Cave Master's message was detailed and precise, which could also be understood as a rigorous and long report. The main meaning was that the 30,000 main forces under the Imperial Tutor were lying in ambush in the Dark Night region. In addition, as the last two barriers to the Dark Night region, the Overlooking Wind region and the Origin Heaven region also had a large number of troops lying in ambush. Among them, there were about 12,000 people lying in ambush in the Overlooking Wind region, and nearly 10,000 people in the Dark Night region. These were the elites that the Imperial Tutor had transferred from the various regions. Most of them were divine lords, and there were dozens of divine kings overseeing the two regions. Chapter 4161. Ji Tianqing had long known that the Imperial Tutor had gathered nearly 500 god kings over the past year. Excluding the 100 or so god kings killed by the Rebel Alliance, there were still more than 360 god kings alive. Since there were more than 360 god kings, it was normal for the Imperial Tutor to transfer 100 god kings to guard the Linfeng domain and the Yuantian domain. If it had been half a month ago, when the four armies of the Rebel Alliance had not converged, it would have been very difficult to conquer the Linfeng domain and the Yuantian domain. At the very least, except for the Northern Army led by Ji Tianqing, it was impossible for the other three armies to defeat the enemy army of more than 10,000. Because of this, Ji Tianqing had already formulated a strategy to conquer all the regions around the boundless heaven continent first, and then approach the Anya domain. This method of extracting silk from a cocoon could slowly erode the territory and weaken the power of the Imperial Tutor. In the end, the Imperial Tutor would only be left with the Anya domain, the Linfeng domain and the Yuantian domain. Tonight, the patriarchs and sect masters came to the meeting to listen to Ji Tianqing's advice and guidance so that they could prepare and respond when they arrived at the domain master's manor tomorrow. After listening to Patriarch Wanyan's report, Ji Tianqing said calmly, "The Linfeng domain and the Yuantian domain only have more people guarding them, but there are no experts that are too difficult to deal with. The elite forces under the Imperial Tutor are concentrated in the Anya domain. Although the Linfeng domain and the Yuantian domain are fortresses and barriers for the Anya domain. But the Imperial Tutor does not have the courage to transfer more troops to support them, and it is impossible for him to personally take action. Therefore, although there will be a certain amount of danger and casualties when we attack the Linfeng domain and the Yuantian domain tomorrow, it will not be a big problem. You don't have to worry too much." Since Ji Tianqing said so, the patriarchs and sect masters were relieved and obviously much more relaxed. Then, Ji Tianqing deduced several possible situations and taught them how to deal with them. Everyone listened carefully and memorized it in their hearts. After a quarter of an hour, the short meeting ended. Everyone left the conference room one after another. Ji Tianxing also returned to the secret chamber to continue meditating. Clan leader Wanyan was in charge of recording the contents of the meeting just now. He mainly recorded what Ji Tianxing said and sent it to Nangong Buhua through a communication jade slip. With that, the army led by Nangong Buhua felt much more confident. They were filled with confidence and anticipation for the invasion of the Origin Heaven domain tomorrow. Time passed quickly. 20 hours later, the evening of the second day arrived. The fleet led by the god-slaying battleship flew across the sky and arrived at the domain chief's manor in the Linfeng domain. The domain chief's manor was located in a secret realm. The secret realm had a circumference of a few 100,000 miles. It was filled with abundant divine energy and resources. It could be said to be one of the best among the hundreds of secret realms, and it was only inferior to the blessed paradises. In addition, the downwind region was rich in resources, and the region master was the imperial tutor's most trusted aide. Therefore, the downwind region had always been very rich and affluent. The number of divine lord experts and divine king powerhouses was much more than other regions. The downwind region master hadn't left the domain chief's manor and gone to the Anya domain to avoid the disaster. As early as half a month ago, he had expressed his attitude to the imperial tutor and vowed to live and die with the soldiers of the downwind region. Even if he died on the battlefield, he wouldn't abandon the domain chief's manor, let alone surrender to the rebel alliance. His loyalty naturally made the imperial tutor feel very gratified and touched. Therefore, the imperial tutor sent a team of personal guards to bring the downwind region master's family and relatives to the Azura Divine Palace in the Anya domain. The imperial tutor wanted to express that he would do his best to protect the downwind region master's family and not distract him so that he could fight with all his strength. Another meaning was that even if the downwind region master died on the battlefield, the imperial tutor would take good care of his family. Of course, this was good, and the downwind region master was grateful. But like everyone else, he couldn't help but think that the imperial tutor had a third intention. That was to use the downwind region master's family as a shackle to force the downwind region master to fight and be loyal to his duty. To put it nicely, this was called encouragement, but to put it bluntly, it was a threat. The downwind region master understood it, but he didn't point it out. Instead, he was very grateful to the imperial tutor. Ever since his family was taken away, he had devoted himself to setting up defenses and preparing for the battle in the past half a month. Under his arrangement and command, 12,000 soldiers protected the inside and outside of the domain chief's manor. In addition to so many soldiers, he also led the soldiers to set up layers of defensive formations. In order not to affect the final battle, he also transferred all the servants of the domain chief's manor to other places. Now, there were 4,000 soldiers outside the secret realm and 8,000 soldiers inside the secret realm. Apart from these 12,000 soldiers, there was not a single person who was not related to them. The downwind region master also wore armor all day and had a sword at his waist. He looked like he was ready to fight at any time and would never return. When the sun was setting, Ji Tianxing's god-slaying battleship arrived outside the domain chief's manor with several other battleships. A few 100 miles ahead, there was a giant mountain that was tens of thousands of feet high. The peak of the mountain was shrouded in a sea of clouds. In the sea of clouds, there was a square with a radius of 100 miles. A huge altar stood in the middle of the square. That was the entrance to the secret realm. A total of 4,000 soldiers in armor and holding swords were firmly guarding the square and the altar at the peak of the mountain. Among them, 2,000 soldiers stood in the open. Their bodies were like javelins and stone statues. The other 2,000 soldiers hid in the dark, ready to provide support at any time. The soldiers of the downwind region all knew that the army that was about to attack the domain chief's manor was personally led by Kenshin. Although everyone believed that Kenshin would take care of his reputation and attack openly instead of sneak attacks, the downwind region master was very cautious. However, the overlord of 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 the overlord region was extremely cautious. However, it turned out that he was overthinking. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. Just as everyone had guessed, The fleet led by the sword god openly appeared in the sea of clouds and stopped 100 miles away from the entrance of the secret realm. The god-slaying battleship was at the forefront, piloted by Long. It opened its wings, revealing 600 flashing muzzles that were aimed at the square at the peak of the mountain. Ji Tianxing walked out of the battleship and stood high in the sky, looking down at the peak of the mountain and the entrance of the secret realm. Behind the god-slaying battleship, the 8 forces battleships were arranged in a wing shape, ready to attack. As soon as the two sides met, they were ready to fight. The atmosphere between heaven and earth seemed to have frozen, filled with murderous intent. Even though the soldiers of the Linfeng domain had expected this day to come and were mentally prepared for it, the Linfeng domain soldiers were still shocked. However, when they saw Kenshin appear with their own eyes, they couldn't help but feel terrified. They had no choice. Kenshin was too famous, and his power was too terrifying. In the past 4 months, Ji Tianxing often cultivated in the distorted time and space of the divine tower in seclusion. Not only did he refine all the divine spark fragments he had, but he also cultivated in seclusion for 10 years. Therefore, his strength had doubled, and his aura was even more unfathomable, like the power of heaven. Chapter 4162. On the plaza at the peak of the mountain, there were 2,000 guards on the surface, and another 2,000 guards were hidden in the dark. At this moment, everyone's attention was on Ji Tianxing. Everyone wanted to know what Kenshin was going to say and do. There were even a few guards who fantasized about how great it would be if Kenshin could sit down and negotiate with the territorial lord. Then the two sides would not have to fight, and they would not become dead souls under Kenshin's sword. Although everyone knew that this was an extravagant hope, the two sides were like fire and water, and there would be a battle. However, under Kenshin's prestige and the threat of death, they still could not help but feel that they were lucky. At this moment, Ji Tianxing looked down at the many guards with an indifferent expression and said in a cold tone, "Although it's useless for me to persuade you to surrender now, I still want to say it clearly. The Rebel Alliance is only fighting to save the people of the world and return peace and tranquility to the world, not to kill. As long as you immediately lay down your arms and surrender, I can spare your lives and let you go." Ji Tianxing's words were not only the original intention of the Rebel Alliance's establishment, but also the principle that the Rebel Alliance had always practiced. His original purpose was not to occupy the boundless heaven continent, to sit on hundreds of millions of people and endless resources, and to enjoy the glory and power of the position of overlord of the continent. He only wanted to destroy the foundation of the Azura God Empress power and save the hundreds of millions of people of the boundless heaven continent. Therefore, the Rebel Alliance occupied more than 90 regions in a short year, but did not waste time to consolidate control of each region, and did not plunder resources and wealth. It was also because of this that the people of the boundless heaven continent saw all of this with their own eyes, so they supported the Rebel Alliance so much and worshipped Ji Tianxing so much. The 4,000 guards on the mountain peak had a somewhat complicated look in their eyes when they heard Ji Tianxing's words. Many guards approved of Ji Tianxing and the Rebel Alliance from the bottom of their hearts, and also believed his words. If they had a choice, of course they would want to lay down their arms and surrender, and not die in vain. However, their status and situation had determined that they could only fight to the death here today. They could not surrender or run away. After a brief moment of silence, a guard commander flew out from the crowd and cupped his fists to Ji Tianxing. With a solemn expression, he said, "Although we are enemies and not friends, Kenshin's conduct is well known by the world. We naturally admire you and would like to thank Kenshin for giving us this opportunity. However, we have military orders and do not dare to disobey. We can only swear to uphold them to the death. Kenshin, sorry for the offense." After saying that, the guard commander drew his sword, raised his arm, and shouted, "Protect our homeland, we will not retreat even if we die." The 2,000 guards in the square also waved their swords and shouted. For a moment, the guards were in high spirits. Their morale had also increased by a lot. They were no longer as dispirited as before. Ji Tianxing didn't waste any time and immediately gave the order to attack. Thus, the god-slaying battleship and the 8 battleships on both sides launched the first round of attacks. Boom, 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 boom. The 9 battleships activated their arrays at almost the same time, releasing more than 5,000 dazzling pillars of light. Like a rain of swords, they cut through the night sky and blasted toward the square on the summit. At that moment, thousands of dazzling pillars of divine power lit up the night sky for tens of thousands of miles. The dense rain-like pillars of light carried with them a destructive power that tore apart the barrier between the night sky and space, creating dense spatial cracks in the night sky. Naturally, the mountain peak with a radius of 100 miles also suffered a devastating blow. Although the 2,000 guards guarding the mountain peak had activated their defensive array in time, forming a huge defensive light shield. But when thousands of pillars of light blasted down, the defensive light shield didn't even last for a moment before shattering. Immediately after, the mountain peak was drowned in dazzling divine light and turned into endless ashes and dust on the spot, stirring up billowing smoke and dust. The entire mountain was destroyed and disappeared, leaving behind only a huge crater and ruins. When the pillars of divine power descended, the 2,000 guards didn't dare to escape due to military orders. They even joined forces to cast spells to resist. Unfortunately, their strength was too weak. Trying to resist the attack of the god-slaying battleship, a supreme-grade king-level divine artifact, was like a mantis trying to stop a chariot. When the billowing smoke and dust dissipated, the earth-shattering explosions gradually stopped. At that moment, the 2,000 guards on the mountain peak also disappeared along with the mountain peak. They didn't even have time to fight back. Under the simultaneous attack of the 9 battleships, they were turned into ashes and dust. Such terrifying power made the 2,000 guards hiding in the dark tremble with fear. They only wanted to turn around and run. Originally, they were hiding in the dark and wanted to use the power of the array to launch a sneak attack while the two sides were fighting. But they never expected that the battle between the 2,000 guards and the Rebel Alliance would end as soon as it started. The 2,000 guards on the square didn't even have a chance to fight back before they were blasted to pieces. How terrifying was that? At that moment, the 2,000 guards hiding in the dark finally understood the terrifying power and methods of the Kenshin. They also finally understood why the territorial lords of the more than 90 domains surrendered at the sight of the battle. They seemed to have no backbone and dignity. If they were in the same situation, they wouldn't care about dignity under the threat of death. Fortunately, the place where they were hiding was quite far from the square on the mountain peak. It was at least 10,000 miles away. Even if the mountain peak was destroyed and they were affected, they only suffered some injuries. They weren't killed. If they were closer, they would probably have been turned into ashes. Retreat, the guard commander ordered. He immediately led the 2,000 guards to retreat into the distance and escape from the battlefield. They had been hiding in the dark and hadn't shown their faces. Even if they turned around and fled now, they would do it secretly. It should be safer. At the entrance of the secret realm, above the ruins, clan leader Wanyan and the others looked at Ji Tianxing and asked, "Alliance leader, those 2,000 people hiding in the dark, should we, Alliance leader, please allow us to chase after them? I guarantee that we will finish them in an hour. Alliance leader, please allow us to go. The military strength of our 3 clans is enough to finish the battle in 15 minutes. Clearly, those 2,000 guards thought that they were hiding, but they had been discovered by Ji Tianxing and the others long ago. However, Ji Tianxing couldn't be bothered with them. Hearing the clan leader's request, Ji Tianxing waved his hand and replied, "They are just soldiers who were forced by military orders. Since they retreated voluntarily, there is no need to make things difficult for them. The most important thing now is to enter the secret realm and finish off the overlooking Wind Zone Lord." The clan leaders didn't have any objections. They all acknowledged the order. Next, everyone started to break the array at the entrance of the secret realm. The array was originally on the mountain peak. After the mountain peak was destroyed, the array altar was also destroyed. The Great Formation was also blasted apart. The invisible formation light wall was exposed and revealed in the sky. It was covered in cracks. Clan leader Wanyan and the others went up. They couldn't be bothered to break the array. The clan leaders joined forces with a dozen divine kings to attack together and break the array with brute force. Chapter 4163. Boom. Crack. With a deafening cracking sound, the array in the sky was broken, and a huge hole appeared. Ji Tianxing stepped through the hole and entered the secret realm of the Windfall Territorial Lord. The god-slaying battleship followed closely behind, and the other 8 forces battleships also entered one after another. The secret realm was spacious, and the scenery was picturesque. However, it was quiet all around, and the air was filled with tension and depression. Half a month ago, the Windfall Territorial Lord had evacuated all unrelated personnel, leaving only 8,000 soldiers to guard the secret realm. At this moment, the secret realm looked peaceful, but danger lurked in every corner. There were arrays and traps everywhere. In the sky, Ji Tianxing stood on the top of the god-slaying battleship with his hands behind his back, looking ahead calmly. The White Dragon steered the god-slaying battleship forward at a steady pace. The 8 divine battleships followed behind, arranged in a sharp knife formation, showing a domineering posture that could penetrate everything. When the fleet had just advanced 10,000 miles, Ji Tianxing frowned. A divine light flashed in his right hand, and he took out the divine hammer. He looked at the empty sky in front of him and waved the divine hammer in his right hand, smashing out 2 beams of dazzling divine light. Swoosh! Swoosh! The 2 beams of divine light carried endless power and smashed into the sky 1,000 miles away, causing 2 earth-shattering explosions. Bang! Bang! In the seemingly empty sky, a canopy actually appeared and was smashed to pieces on the spot. Obviously, it was a trap array set up by the Windfall Territorial Lord. It had been invisible before it was activated. However, this hidden array could not escape Ji Tianxing's eyes. He had seen through it a long time ago. The array was broken, and the fleet was not affected at all. They continued to advance. Next, the fleet had to advance 10,000 miles to reach the Territorial Lord's mansion. During this process, Ji Tianxing would find 7 trap arrays, killing arrays, and maze arrays, as well as 6 traps. The Windfall Territorial Lord had spent a lot of effort, time, manpower, and resources to set up those arrays and traps. However, Ji Tianxing could always see through them in advance and break them quickly with simple and violent means. The fleet had been advancing steadily without any obstruction. 100 breaths later, the fleet arrived outside the Domain Chief's manor. At this time, in the Domain Chief's manor surrounded by mountains, the Domain Chief had already received the news through the reports of the various surveillance formations and scouts. When he found out that the formations and traps he had set up with all his might had failed to cause any trouble to the fleet, he was shocked. Therefore, Kenshin was able to easily break through the array formations and traps. His expression immediately turned ugly, and his eyes flashed with deep shock and awe. He couldn't help but sigh, as expected of the Kenshin. I spent nearly a month of effort, but I couldn't even stop him for a moment. Hee. Other than the Imperial Tutor, who else is qualified to exchange blows with him? The Windfall District Lord's lips curled into a bitter smile. He had already predicted the outcome. But even so, there was no turning back. He could not back down, nor could he back down. After all, he was the #1 loyal subject of the Imperial Tutor. The imprint on him was too deep and could not be erased. Even if he wanted to surrender, Kenshin might not accept it. Moreover, his family had been taken away by the Imperial Tutor to the Dark Knight domain. If he surrendered now, he was afraid that his family would not have a good ending. Let's go. Let's see the glory of the peerless Kenshin with our own eyes. The Windfall District Lord collected his chaotic thoughts. He stood up and straightened his cloak. Then, he led the generals out of the study. Outside the Domain Chief's manor, 8,000 elite soldiers were divided into 2 circles to protect the Domain Chief's manor. The defensive formation within a radius of 10,000 miles was also activated. There were a total of 3 layers, protecting dozens of mountains within it. The soldiers were all equipped with armor and swords. They were ready to attack. Their murderous aura surged as they looked sternly at the 9 warships in the sky outside the formation. The 9 warships were still in the knife-edge formation. The thousands of soldiers had yet to show themselves. Only Ji Tianxing stood at the top of the Godslayer warship and looked at the Domain Chief's manor indifferently. He could see through the 3 layers of defensive formations at a glance. They were all king-grade divine formations. Their power was interconnected, and their power was superimposed. For an ordinary god king, the 3 layers of defensive formations were difficult to deal with. They could not be broken in a short time. However, Ji Tianxing did not take them seriously. With the Godslayer warship and his divine hammer, he could quickly break through them. He waited patiently and did not rush to attack because the uneasiness in his heart had not disappeared. He was very confident that there were only 8,000 soldiers and the Windfall District Lord in the domain chief's manor. However, he still wanted to see if there were any other ambushes besides the 8,000 soldiers. Or perhaps, the Imperial Tutor had made arrangements and plans to ambush some experts here. If the 2 sides were to fight, and the Azura God Emperor's avatar suddenly appeared, that would be the most surprising and exciting thing for him. Although it sounded ridiculous, he did not rule out this possibility. Because he believed in the warning given by the heavens. Soon, the Windfall District Lord, escorted by a dozen divine generals, flew to the sky above the domain chief's manor. They were thousands of miles away from Ji Tianxing. They faced each other across the defensive formation. Greetings, Kenshin. As soon as the 2 sides met, the Windfall District Lord and a dozen divine generals cupped their fists and bowed to Ji Tianxing. Both their tone and posture were respectful. They were sincere and not pretentious. Although the 2 sides were enemies, there was no deep hatred between them. Even if they had to fight with their weapons and fight with their lives, it was only because they were on different sides. This did not stop the Windfall District Lord and the others from showing respect to Kenshin from the bottom of their hearts. Not all enemies were bad people. It was even more impossible for them to be unreasonable and vicious people. Those who could become god kings and domain lords might be sinister and treacherous, or they might be scheming. However, none of them were fools. In fact, everyone in the boundless heaven continent knew whether Kenshin's actions were for his own benefit or for the sake of justice. Ji Tianxing nodded slightly in return and said, "Everyone, you're too courteous. The great battle is imminent. I have a few words to say. Although they may be nonsense, I still have to say them. After all, what I and the Rebel Alliance are doing is not for the sake of killing or power. It is only for freedom and peace. Everyone present, if you can stop now and surrender, you can also avoid the calamity of the weapons and make even more soldiers sacrifice their lives. I promise to spare one of you from death and not pursue the matter." In fact, both sides' attitudes were very clear. These words were just a formality. If there were really soldiers who surrendered, Ji Tianxing would certainly fulfill his promise. However, the result was as everyone expected. None of the generals stepped forward to admit defeat. The Windfall District Lord also cupped his fists and bowed. Kenshin, as the saying goes, a loyal man should serve with his life. Life is small, but reputation is important. Although we are not strong enough to defeat you, we are not afraid to die on the battlefield in the name of loyalty and filial piety. The so-called loyalty was naturally loyal to the Imperial Tutor and the Azura God Emperor. As for filial piety, it was naturally to protect his family. If he died here, he would leave behind the name of a loyal subject. The Imperial Tutor would also take good care of his family. If he surrendered now, he could live, but he would have to bear a bad reputation and implicate his family. Chapter 4164. Since the Protectorate Lord had made his stance clear, there was nothing more for them to say. Ji Tianxing stopped persuading them to surrender. He raised his hand and gave the order to attack. The 9 divine warships led by the god-slaying battleships were ready to attack. They had activated the array and accumulated powerful energy. The 500 cannons on each warship were aimed at the defensive array of the Protectorate Lord's mansion. When Ji Tianxing gave the order to attack, the 9 divine warships released destructive energy. Boom, 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 boom. More than 3,000 cannons spewed out dazzling divine light. They turned into thousands of dazzling light pillars and blasted at the defensive array. The 50 God Kings and 8,000 soldiers under the Region Lord's command were prepared for battle long ago. When the 9 divine warships launched their attack, they joined forces to cast spells and injected endless divine power into the array to strengthen it. At the same time, hundreds of soldiers who specialized in operating the divine array also controlled the array to release thousands of Kenshin light blades toward the 9 divine warships. Bang, 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 bang. Boom, boom, In the next moment, the sky-covering divine power light pillars collided with all kinds of light blades. There was a deafening explosion in the sky and it spread for tens of thousands of miles. Many light beams and light blades collapsed in the collision, splashing fragments all over the sky. The explosive energy wrapped around the divine light fragments and formed a torrent that spread outward and swept everything away. In the blink of an eye, the divine power light blades that filled the sky were shattered. More than half of the 3,000 light pillars released by the 9 divine warships collapsed. The remaining 1,000 light pillars hit the defensive array. Bang, bang, bang. Another series of loud noises reverberated between heaven and earth. Domain Lord Linfeng had thought that the 8,000 soldiers would be able to counter the 2,000 light pillars. The remaining 1,000 light pillars shouldn't be a threat to the defensive array. But he forgot that more than 300 of the light pillars were released by the god-slaying battleships. Boom. Crack. Therefore, amidst the crisp shattering sounds, hundreds of holes were blasted into the first layer of the defensive formation, and the cracks were densely packed. The defensive light shield was severely damaged. It flashed with divine light and shook violently. Although the light shield didn't shatter or collapse, it had lost its protective power and needed to be repaired. In the midst of the battle, the Headwind Region Lord and the others naturally did not have the opportunity to repair the formation. At this moment, Ji Tianxing waved his divine hammer again and struck out 2 beams of divine light, striking the holes and cracks in the formation. Crack! Along with the sound of an explosion, the first layer of the defensive light shield was shattered and dissipated into pieces. Seeing this, the hearts of the Linfeng District Lord and the 8,000 soldiers skipped a beat, and they all looked anxious and worried. His opponent had only used a single round of attacks from the godly warship, yet they had managed to break through a layer of defensive light barrier so easily. It was obvious that the remaining 2 layers of defensive formations would not be able to hold on for much longer. The Overlord of 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 the Overlord. The 9 divine warships gathered their power again and released thousands of light pillars, launching a second powerful attack. Filled with anxiety, the Downwind Protectorate Lord personally controlled the second layer of the formation, raising its defensive power to the maximum. Peng peng peng. This time, the thousands of light pillars struck the defensive formation, causing an earth-shattering boom to erupt. The light barrier was also riddled with cracks. The 8,000 soldiers of the Linfeng district did not fight back. They supported the defensive formation with all their might, but they still couldn't block the attacks of the 9 divine warships. The king-level upper-class divine warships of the 8 forces were not so bad. Although they were powerful, they couldn't break the defensive light shield with one hit. The most powerful and lethal one was still Ji Tianxing's god-slaying warship. After cracks appeared in the defensive formation, Ji Tianxing waved his divine hammer and smashed out 4 beams of dazzling divine light. Kaboom! Another deafening explosion sounded, and the second layer of the defensive formation was also destroyed. The 8,000 soldiers of the Linfeng district panicked. Their hearts were burning with anxiety and worry. The Linfeng district lord also knew that it was useless to fight back, so he personally cast a spell and led the soldiers in a counterattack. Needless to say, the 8,000 soldiers activated their divine power with all their might and performed all kinds of secret techniques and trump cards. Kaboom! The light pillars released by the 9 divine warships collided with the divine light shadows in the sky, creating a deafening sound. This time, the 9 divine warships attacked 3 times in a row before the third layer of the defensive formation was completely destroyed. Without the protection of the 3 layers of formations, the 8,000 soldiers of the district lord's mansion were completely exposed to the fleet. Everyone knew that the moment of life and death had come. The 8,000 soldiers all looked solemn. They launched the final counterattack with solemn and resolute emotions. The Linfeng district lord hurriedly ordered the soldiers to spread out and fight the 9 divine warships. If they stayed together, they would only become living targets for the fleet. This tactic worked. After the 8,000 soldiers spread out, the bombardment of the 9 divine warships did not cause too many casualties. Instead, after the soldiers spread out, they attacked with all their might, which put the 8 divine warships in danger. Therefore, Ji Tianxing also decisively ordered the soldiers to attack. Thousands of disciples of the 8 forces flew out of the divine warships. Under the leadership of the family leaders and elders, they started to fight the soldiers of the Linfeng district. Thus, the true battle began. More than 10,000 divine emperors and nearly 100 divine kings fought fiercely on the battlefield within a radius of 50,000 miles. The sky darkened and the earth dimmed. Almost every moment, soldiers from both sides were killed. Flesh and blood splattered everywhere. They let out painful and dying cries. The area was completely chaotic. Scenes of blood and fire intertwined were everywhere. Ji Tianxing did not stay idle. He led Yun Yarrow, Ji Ku, and 10 other people into the battlefield. They each looked for a target to kill. Ji Tianxing's target was naturally the Linfeng district lord and the divine generals beside him. Yun Yarrow, Ji Ku, and the others were mainly responsible for killing the enemy's divine kings and protecting their own troops. This fierce battle lasted for a whole hour before it ended. The aftermath of the battle between the two sides blasted the area within a radius of 50,000 miles into ruins. Towering mountains and steep ridges, dense forests and vegetation, as well as the magnificent Linfeng district lord's mansion, many palaces and courtyards, all turned into dust. After an hour, the battle finally ended. The loud noise that reverberated between heaven and earth slowly dissipated. The dust and rain of blood that blotted out the sky continued to fall. There was no suspense about the outcome of the battle. The Linfeng district lord and his 8,000 soldiers had all died on the battlefield. They turned into dust and returned to heaven and earth. They had paid the price with their lives for loyalty and righteousness. Ji Tianxing's troops had also lost close to 1,000 people. But compared to the enemy's complete annihilation, this battle could be said to be a complete victory. After the battle, Ji Tianxing only collected the godhead fragments of the 50 divine kings. He handed over the task of cleaning the battlefield and collecting the spoils of war to his subordinates. 2 hours later, the news that the Linfeng district lord had been defeated and the rebel alliance had captured the Linfeng district spread. 4 hours later, another army of the rebel alliance had also defeated the Yuantian district lord and captured the Yuantian district. As a result, only the Anya district had not been captured by the rebel alliance on the entire boundless heaven continent. Chapter 4165. The army led by Nangong Buhua was responsible for attacking the origin heaven domain. Although that army didn't have Ji Tianxing overseeing it, there were more divine emperors than Nangong Buhua. However, the army was larger in number, and there were more god kings among them. There were only about 10,000 soldiers guarding the origin heaven domain. Therefore, it wasn't difficult for the army led by Nangong Buhua to win. A few hours later, the night passed, and a new day arrived. The news that the overlooking wind domain and the origin heaven domain had been captured by the rebel alliance, and that the 2 domain lords and 20,000 soldiers had all died in battle spread across the boundless heaven continent. When the billions of people heard the news, they celebrated with joy, feeling proud of the rebel alliance and the Kenshin. Everyone believed that in a few days, the Kenshin would capture the Anya domain and kill the imperial tutor, and the war that had lasted for a year would be over. The dark rule and oppression that had lasted for thousands of years on the boundless heaven continent had also come to an end. This was a world-shaking event that changed the era and the overlord's position. It would definitely be recorded in history and praised by future generations for tens of thousands of years. The billions of people were honored to be able to witness the whole process with their own eyes. At the same time, when the news reached the Anya domain, the billions of people were excited and full of anticipation. Although the people of this domain were the most oppressed by the Azura Divine Palace, they feared and hated the Azura Divine Palace the most. At the beginning of the Rebel Alliance's uprising, they didn't have any hope. But as one domain after another was captured by the Kenshin, more and more people regained their freedom, and they also had hope and expectations. Now, The 99 domains of the entire boundless heaven continent had been occupied, and only the Anya domain had not been captured. Of course, the people were excited, expectant, and a little anxious. They even hoped that the two armies of the Rebel Alliance wouldn't rest, and that they would rush to the Anya domain and capture it as soon as possible. It would be best if they could capture the Anya domain in a day or two, save the billions of people, and announce that peace and freedom had been restored to the entire boundless heaven continent. On the other side, the 30,000 soldiers under the imperial tutor were all restless and worried when they heard the news. The army's morale, which had just stabilized some time ago, collapsed by more than half in a day. Everyone in the army was discussing this matter. Everyone was in low spirits and their hearts were burning with anxiety. After all, the Dark Night region was already surrounded on all sides. They were alone and without help. Even if they had 30,000 soldiers, they still had the numerical advantage against the 20,000 soldiers of the Rebel Alliance. However, they had already lost their momentum. Everyone felt that they would definitely lose this battle. Thus, many of the low-level soldiers gathered together to discuss whether or not they should escape. There was still a chance to escape before the two armies of the Rebel Alliance entered the Dark Night domain and completed the encirclement. Over 200 Divine King powerhouses and generals naturally took notice of such a great disturbance in the morale of the army. They were also very worried and anxious. They issued strict orders many times to not allow the soldiers to discuss the Rebel Alliance, but it was useless. On the contrary, the more they suppressed the soldiers, the more they wanted to escape. As a result, the helpless god-kings and generals could only ask the 12 divine generals for a countermeasure. In their opinion, the 12 divine generals had met the imperial tutor and had a secret conversation with the imperial tutor. As for why the imperial tutor was so confident and calm, he must have told them the reason. The 200 divine kings and generals hoped that the 12 divine generals would also tell them so that they could be at ease. Not long after, the 200 divine kings and generals expressed their wishes to the 12 divine generals. Unfortunately, the 12 divine generals made it clear that the imperial tutor had strictly ordered them to keep it a secret and not reveal any information. However, they could guarantee that the reason why the imperial tutor was so confident and calm was absolutely reliable. The soldiers did not have to worry about the Rebel Alliance at all. No matter how powerful the Kenshin was, the Azura Divine Palace would be fine. Victory would belong to them. Just like that, the 200 divine kings and generals were dismissed. Although they were still confused and did not know the specific reason, they felt much more at ease. However, the awkward thing was that when faced with the countless soldiers under their command, they still had no way to explain it. They could only pat their chests and swear that the imperial tutor had already thought of a countermeasure and had made preparations. He was just waiting for the Rebel Alliance to come and throw away their lives. Everyone did not have to worry or doubt. The Azura Divine Palace would definitely stand tall and the Rebel Alliance would be destroyed in the end. These meaningless words had no effect on the soldiers. The soldiers, whose morale was at its lowest and whose hearts were heavy, would not believe these words. In fact, many people believed that the imperial tutor had not done anything in the past few months and was waiting for death to come. Now that the Rebel Alliance had already killed their way to their doorstep and the imperial tutor had not done anything, he must have been at his wits' end. Since that was the case, there was no need to wait any longer. It was better to run. Thus, on the second night after the Rebel Alliance conquered the Overwind and Origin Sky regions, more than 3,000 divine lords fled the Dark Night region. On the third night, several divine kings and more than 1,000 divine lords took the opportunity to escape. On the fourth night, there were still more than 1,000 people who planned to escape. However, the strict inspection of the generals did not give them the chance to escape. Even so, only 25,000 of the 30,000 soldiers of the Dark Night region remained. Compared to the 20,000 soldiers of the Rebel Alliance, they did not have much of an advantage. On the fifth day, the 1,000 or so soldiers who had failed to escape became restless again. Unfortunately, when the sun set, the Rebel Alliance's army finally arrived. The first to arrive outside the Azura Paradise was the fleet led by the god-slaying warship. The Azura Paradise was the lair of the Azura God Emperor. The famous Azura Divine Palace was inside. The paradise was 1,000,000 miles wide and was like a small world. It had a vast territory and rich resources. Normally, the Azura Divine Palace housed nearly 100,000 people. Most of them were servants and family members. There were only 10,000 guards and dozens of divine kings. However, at this moment, 15,000 of the 25,000 soldiers under the command of the imperial tutor were inside the paradise. The other 10,000 soldiers were guarding outside the paradise. Some of the soldiers were guarding the paradise's entrance. Most of them were patrolling the surroundings and monitoring the movements. A few months ago, traps, ambushes, and all kinds of formations were set up around the paradise's entrance. Ji Tianxing rode the god-slaying warship and led the army toward the paradise's entrance. Along the way, he found more than a dozen traps and formations. He either tried to avoid them or destroyed them by force. Since he used his arts to destroy the traps and formations, it would definitely cause a huge commotion. Therefore, the fleet could not hide their tracks. When they were 50,000 miles away from the Azura Paradise's entrance, they were discovered by the patrolling guards. Chapter 4166. The soldiers of the Dark Knight domain had been waiting for several months. Now, the Anti-Rebels Alliance, which was at the height of its power, had finally arrived at the Azura Mystic Realm. The moment the fleet appeared, the patrolling guards were stunned for a moment before they came to their senses. They quickly alerted the generals guarding the entrance and reported the news to the divine generals guarding the Azura Paradise. After doing all this, everyone actually felt a sense of relief, as if a heavy burden had been lifted off their shoulders. That feeling was like a person who had a terminal illness and knew that there was no cure and that he would die without a doubt. However, he spent day after day in torment and waited for several months without dying. During this process, he endured tremendous pressure and mental torture. Finally, one day, death came. Naturally, he would have the feeling that it's finally here, I'm finally free. The patrolling guards and the soldiers guarding the entrance of the Azura Paradise all had the same thought. Even though they knew that they would most likely be killed in the final battle with the Kenshin and the Rebel Alliance. However, they would rather have a quick result than wait in torment. Fortunately, the Rebel Alliance represented an upright and mighty army. At this moment, the final battle was imminent and they would not launch a sneak attack. The god-slaying battleship led the fleet and flew through the sky at a moderate speed. They crushed and flattened several arrays and stopped 2,000 miles away from the Azura Paradise's entrance. This gave the patrolling guards and the soldiers guarding the Azura Paradise's entrance time to react and prepare. Soon, the news reached the Azura Divine Palace and was known by the imperial tutor and many generals. The sound of a horn immediately sounded in the Divine Palace, waking everyone up. Their families, relatives, and servants all retreated to the depths of the Divine Palace and patiently waited for the result of the battle. The imperial tutor also put on a luxurious divine robe and a divine crown. Surrounded by a group of divine generals, he rushed to the Azura Paradise's entrance in a grandiose manner. Today's battle was inevitable. It was also the final battle between the two sides. The imperial tutor had been biding his time and keeping a low profile for several months. He was waiting for this day to wash away his shame and feel proud. He wanted to make a comeback and let the Kenshin and the Rebel Alliance feel what a shocking reversal and despair was. He also wanted the people of the boundless heaven continent to see that this continent ultimately belonged to the Azura God Emperor. No one could shake or snatch it away. Not even the legendary Kenshin could do it. Therefore, the imperial tutor dressed up and set off with steady steps and a dignified posture. Not long after, he appeared at the Azura Paradise's entrance with thousands of soldiers. The entrance was in the vast sea of clouds. There was a cloud platform with a radius of 100 miles. 5,000 soldiers in armor and swords stood on top of it. In the sky around the cloud platform, there were another 5,000 soldiers who had already arranged themselves in a defensive formation, confronting the fleet of the Anti-Rebel Alliance. Azura Paradises, Azura Paradises, Azura Paradises, Azura Paradise as Paradises, Azura Paradise. The imperial preceptor nodded gracefully and reservedly, indicating for the soldiers to dispense with the formalities. He then turned his gaze to the fleet 2,000 miles away and stared at the god-slaying battleship in the lead. 9 god-slaying battleships floated quietly in the sky. The attack formation had been activated and was silently accumulating power. The cannons were all pointed at the Azura Paradise's entrance. However, no one showed up, including Kenshin. The Imperial tutor furrowed his white brows. The 2 strands of white hair at his temples danced in the wind. He said in a low and dignified tone, "Kenshin, how have you been? I've been waiting for today's battle for almost a year. You're finally here. Why, are you still hiding and not willing to show up?" During the Great War of the Gods 1,000 years ago, the Imperial tutor had followed the Azura God Emperor into battle. He was one of the main forces that besieged and killed Kenshin. Therefore, not only were the 2 familiar and understood each other, but they also had a deep hatred. The Imperial tutor purposely said this to test what Ji Tianxing was doing and why he didn't show up. He wanted to know if there was any conspiracy. However, Ji Tianxing wasn't provoked by him. He still sat in the cockpit of the god-slaying battleship, silently adjusting his breath with his eyes closed. In fact, he was waiting for the army led by Nangong Buhua to gather here. At the same time, the uneasiness in the depths of his heart still lingered. He didn't act rashly because he wanted to see what the Imperial tutor had up his sleeves. However, it was obvious that the battle hadn't started yet. The Imperial tutor was very calm and didn't show his trump card right from the start. The 2 sides were in a stalemate. The Imperial tutor provoked him again, but Ji Tianxing didn't respond. Such an attitude made the Imperial tutor feel despised and humiliated. He was furious. Therefore, he didn't ask for a rebuff. He simply ordered the soldiers on the cloud platform and ordered them to form a battle formation. The ordinary soldiers felt heavy and uneasy. They could only follow orders and didn't dare to talk or mock Ji Tianxing. However, the 12 divine generals beside the Imperial tutor wanted to help the Imperial tutor resolve the awkwardness. They all mocked Ji Tianxing and the Rebel Alliance. In their opinion, it would be best if they could anger the Kenshin and force the Rebel Alliance to attack earlier. However, Ji Tianxing seemed to have seen through their thoughts and tricks. He turned a deaf ear to their provocation and mockery. Time passed quietly. Half an hour passed quickly. A few divine lights lit up in the sky from the east of the Secret Realm's entrance. They were flying over at lightning speed. They were 11 divine battleships of different shapes. Each divine battleship carried more than 900 people or more than 1,000 people. This was the army of 11 factions led by Nangong Buhua. There were nearly 10,000 people in total. Swoosh! Under the gazes of countless people, this fleet streaked across the sky and stopped at the entrance of the Grotto Heaven. Nangong Buhua didn't meet up with Ji Tianxing. He also stopped 2,000 miles away from the cloud platform. Moreover, his and Ji Tianxing's fleets were 10,000 miles apart. One was in the east and the other was in the west. Of course, this wasn't Nangong Buhua's decision. It was Ji Tianxing's order. After the fleet stabilized, they immediately activated the attack formation and took out their divine cannons. They accumulated a lot of divine power. At the same time, Nangong Buhua and the leaders of the 10 factions all sent messages to Ji Tianxing to greet him. "Greetings, Alliance Leader. Greetings, Alliance Leader. This subordinate is late. I've kept Lord Alliance Master waiting for so long. Please punish me." The last sentence was naturally said by Nangong Buhua. The 2 fleets had agreed on a time to arrive at the entrance of the Azura Grotto Heaven at the same time. However, Nangong Buhua was 1 hour late. Ji Tianxing stopped resting and stood up. He looked out of the divine battleship and emitted a powerful aura. He sent a voice transmission to Nangong Buhua and asked, "Although I'm 1 hour late, it doesn't affect the overall situation. Did anything unexpected happen on your way here?" In the past hour, he was most worried that the Imperial tutor had planted some trump cards and took the opportunity to kill Nangong Buhua's fleet. Nangong Buhua quickly replied, "Sorry for making you worry. Nothing unexpected happened." Chapter 4167. Ji Tianxing had already analyzed how the Imperial tutor would use his trump card if he really had a trump card. There were only 2 possibilities. Either he would kill Nangong Buhua's army on the way, or he would ambush in the Shura Grotto heaven and launch a surprise attack at the critical moment. Since Nangong Buhua's fleet had arrived, the first possibility was eliminated. "I want to see what you have up your sleeve." Ji Tianxing raised his eyebrows and looked at the imperial tutor on the cloud platform as he muttered to himself. The next moment, he flew out of the god-slaying battleship and landed on the top of the battleship. He stood proudly in the wind and exuded a powerful aura that could suppress everything in the world. He stared at the imperial tutor and said in a dignified tone, "If this is all you have, then you'd better stretch out your neck and die. Don't waste time." The imperial tutor frowned and said with a cold smile, "Kenshin, I haven't seen you for 1,000 years, but you're still as arrogant as before. Humph, it seems that you've been too arrogant because of your previous triumphant progress. Do you know that this is the day I've been waiting for? I want to beat you down to the ground and kill you on the spot when you're at your most arrogant moment. Only then can you experience the feeling of falling from the peak to hell and know what despair is." Ji Tianxing raised his eyebrows, and a thought-provoking smile appeared on the corners of his mouth. He asked, "Just you and the soldiers under your command? Do you have the confidence to do so? Tell me, what's your trump card? Is it the Shura God Emperor? Tell him to stop hiding and come out for a fight." Even though his words were probing, he already had a 70% chance of knowing what the imperial preceptor was relying on. The imperial tutor did not show any reaction, but he was laughing coldly in his heart. "Kenshin, if you're afraid, just say it. Just admit defeat and surrender. Why do you have to talk so much nonsense?" The imperial tutor looked at Ji Tianxing expressionlessly and said in a cold voice, "As long as you admit defeat and surrender, even if this old man says that I will spare your life, you will not believe me. You must die, but this old man can give you a dignified death. In addition, this old man will not pursue the crimes of the dozen or so forces under your command. What do you think? Isn't this old man magnanimous enough?" Ji Tianxing couldn't be bothered with his words. He raised his hand and gave the order to attack. In a split second, the deity-slaying battleship was the first to open fire. It released 600 destructive light beams that bombarded the entrance of the Azura paradise. The 20 divine warships of the two armies followed closely behind. They also released thousands of light pillars that blasted toward the cloud platform in a radius of 100 miles. The sky, which had been calm and tranquil just a moment ago, was instantly covered by a dazzling divine light, turning into a colorful world. Facing the bombardment of the light pillars, the nearly 10,000 soldiers on the cloud platform did not panic. Immediately, someone activated the defensive formation. There was no need for the imperial tutor or the divine generals to give the order. Tens of thousands of soldiers worked together to unleash their ultimate skills and launched a counterattack. Swish, 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 swish. Tens of thousands of blades of divine light and all kinds of wind, fire, and lightning surged toward the two armies of the Rebel Alliance like a flood. In the next moment, the divine light torrent and the thousands of light pillars collided violently. There was a loud explosion that shook the 9 heavens. Boom, 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 boom. The deafening sound reverberated in the sky. The area around the entrance of the Azura paradise became a battlefield. It was drowned in the 5-colored divine light. Countless light pillars and divine art projections collapsed. Billions of fragments of divine light burst out and rained down from the sky. The violent and devastating shockwaves were like rings of multicolored ripples, constantly spreading outwards and crashing into the surrounding mountains. In the blink of an eye, the area within a radius of 50,000 miles was razed to the ground. The mountains and forests disappeared, turning into scorched earth and ruins. Even the sea of clouds in the sky was dispelled. Dozens of pitch-black spatial rifts were torn open in the sky. Under such an earth-shattering collision and explosion, the cloud platform suspended high in the sky was not destroyed. This was because the joint counterattack of tens of thousands of soldiers had destroyed more than half of the light pillars. The remaining half of the light pillars crashed into the cloud platform's defensive array and shattered. The supreme-grade king-level defensive array also trembled violently. Dozens of cracks appeared on it. All this time, when the Rebel Alliance had occupied nearly 100 regions of the boundless heaven continent, The domain chief's manor in each region was only protected by a supreme-grade king-level defensive array. This was the Azura Paradise, the home of the Azura God-Emperor. It was the most majestic place in the entire boundless heaven continent. The defensive array at the entrance of the Azura Paradise was, of course, supreme-grade king-level defensive array. Even inside the Azura Paradise, many important palaces, mansions, and treasure vaults were protected by supreme-grade king-level divine arrays. Although the two armies of the Rebel Alliance had joined forces to attack for the first time, they did not break through the Cloud Platform's defensive array. In the eyes of the Imperial Tutor and the others, the defensive array was indestructible and invincible. They did not expect that the Rebel Alliance's first round of attack would cause cracks to appear on the defensive array. This made the soldiers' hearts skip a beat. They had a bad premonition. Before the Imperial Tutor and the others could react, Ji Tianxing waved the divine hammer again. A few beams of dazzling light smashed into the defensive array. The Imperial Tutor and the many heavenly generals came back to their senses. They immediately cast spells to resist and protect the defensive array. However, they were one step too slow. After a few loud bangs, the defensive array shook violently again. It was on the verge of collapse. Following a series of cracking sounds, a few more cracks appeared on the huge defensive light barrier. Moreover, the dozens of cracks from before had expanded several times. 2 gaps had appeared. Unfortunately, the gaps were not big. They were only 30 feet long and wide. It was not suitable for the Rebel Alliance's fleet to enter. Therefore, Ji Tianxing and the 21 divine battleships of the Rebel Alliance launched a second round of attack. The Imperial Tutor hurriedly ordered the heavenly generals and godly kings to cast spells to replenish the defensive array's energy and quickly repair the gaps and cracks in the array. This was the key defense of the Shura Grotto Heaven. It was the second barrier. It could not be broken so easily. The nearly 10,000 soldiers on the Cloud Platform and the 5,000 soldiers in the surroundings immediately seized this opportunity to cast spells and besiege the 21 divine battleships of the Rebel Alliance. Boom, boom, boom. Tens of thousands of divine light blades and various divine spells poured down like a torrential flood. They drowned the 21 divine battleships. Only the god-slaying battleship blocked the attacks and remained unscathed. The other 20 king-level divine battleships suffered varying degrees of damage. Many dents and cracks appeared on the surface of the battleships. If the 15,000 soldiers under the Imperial Tutor attacked a few more times, the 20 divine battleships would be destroyed. Therefore, clan leader Wanyan, Nangong Buhua, and the others roared and led their soldiers to charge out. Kill. Break through the Shura Grotto Heaven and kill the Shura Divine Palace. This is the moment to decide the victory. The clan leaders and sect leaders shouted as they led their soldiers to attack. They began to fight with the enemy. Book Guest House Reading Website. Chapter 4168. A full-scale war broke out. The god-slaying battleships and the 21 godly battleships attacked the defensive array at the Grotto Heaven's entrance with all their might. Ji Tianxing and the 20 clan leaders and sect masters led 20,000 soldiers to fight against the 15,000 soldiers under the Imperial Tutor's command. The Imperial Tutor originally wanted to maintain his dignity and posture as the commander-in-chief. He wanted to stay on the battlefield and command his soldiers to fight. However, when he saw Kenshin personally leading the charge, he had no choice but to join the battle. He couldn't just watch as his godly kings and generals were killed one by Kenshin, could he? Thus, the battle reached an extremely intense level not long after it started. The Rebel Alliance unleashed all their potential in order to obtain the final victory. They charged forward without any regard for the consequences. Even Yun Yarrow, Ji Ku, Bai Feng, and Chao Qingyu joined the battle. It was worth mentioning that Ji Wuhan, who had broken through to the godly king realm not long ago, Ji Wushuang, Zhen Hong, Lin Shui, and the others also joined the battle. Now, the dozen or so people who followed Ji Tianxing had all become godly kings. None of them were weak. The Imperial Tutor's soldiers didn't fight for honor or dignity. They only fought for their lives. They fought with all their might regardless of the cost. In order to block the Rebel Alliance's ferocious attacks, the 15,000 soldiers took out all kinds of trump cards and used their life-saving divine artifacts and methods. There were even some who were seriously injured and knew that they would die for sure. They brazenly used forbidden secret techniques or self-destructed. Those who used forbidden secret techniques and sacrificed their divine bodies, lifespan, and cultivation to temporarily gain super-powerful combat strength were still manageable. However, the few godly kings who were forced into a corner and self-destructed when they knew that they would die for sure did cause a huge commotion on the battlefield. They caused a terrifying amount of destruction. After all, self-destruction was an indiscriminate attack. It didn't differentiate between friend and foe. Boom, boom, boom. After several earth-shattering explosions, several colorful mushroom clouds appeared on the battlefield. In the blink of an eye, the destructive five-colored shockwave swept across hundreds of thousands of miles, flattening countless mountains and forests. Because of the self-destruction of the 5 godly kings, more than 1,000 godly monarchs of the Rebel Alliance were killed and more than 2,000 were injured. Nearly 1,000 of the Imperial Tutor's soldiers were blown to smithereens, and more than 1,000 were severely injured. The losses on both sides were similar, but the Imperial Tutor was so depressed that he wanted to vomit blood. There was nothing he could do about it. Those 5 high-level divine kings who had self-detonated were all capable generals under his command. They were basically the first batch of region masters who had received orders to return. In the end, before these 5 capable assistants could do much, they were forced to self-destruct. If they died, then so be it. Why did they have to kill over 1,000 of their own people and injure over 1,000 others? The number of soldiers under the Imperial Tutor's command was already small to begin with, and now the situation was even worse. This already made the Imperial Tutor very depressed. But what made him even angrier and more aggrieved was yet to come. After the battle began, Ji Tianxing had been staring at the godly generals and high-level divine kings around him, specifically targeting the stronger ones. The Imperial Tutor used all his strength every time, wanting to fight Ji Tianxing head-on. But Ji Tianxing easily neutralized his attacks. He did not take advantage of the situation to counterattack. Instead, he killed the other godly generals and high-level divine kings instantly. None of the region masters and godly generals of the 7th and 8th tier of the godly king realm were a match for Ji Tianxing. They could only be killed instantly. The Imperial Tutor was also a peak-level divine king, but he admitted that he could not do this. Seeing that the number of capable generals around him was rapidly decreasing, the Imperial Tutor was very worried, but at the same time, he was also very shocked and frightened. Before this, he already knew that Ji Tianxing's strength could be said to be invincible below the God Emperor. Otherwise, he would not have been able to kill the Grand Marshal so easily. However, the Imperial Tutor did not have a clear idea of how strong Ji Tianxing was. Now that they were fighting, he finally experienced it. It was not an exaggeration to say that when he fought Ji Tianxing, he felt as oppressive as when he was facing the Azura God Emperor. In his opinion, Ji Tianxing's combat strength seemed to be close to the Azura God Emperor's. This news was very shocking and hard to believe. 15 minutes later, the battle between the two armies paused for a moment. 4,000 of the 15,000 soldiers under the Imperial Tutor's command had been killed. Moreover, the number of mid-level godly kings and above who were killed was also very high. The remaining 11,000 soldiers took advantage of the situation to retreat and catch their breath. Of the 20,000 soldiers of the Rebel Alliance, more than 3,000 had died in battle. The remaining 16,000 had retreated 1,000 miles and were catching their breath under the protection of the fleet. On the surface, it seemed that the Rebel Alliance did not have any advantage. However, in reality, the Rebel Alliance had the upper hand and had the advantage. After all, the Imperial Tutor's army had the protection of that supreme-grade king-level divine formation. The number of godly kings who had died was even higher. The reason why both sides had stopped fighting temporarily was because the defensive formation at the Grotto Heaven's entrance was already filled with cracks and was on the verge of collapse. At this moment, Ji Tianxing finally took out the famous Sword of Burial of Heaven. Sword of World Annihilation. He absorbed a huge amount of the power of the autonomous realm and held the Sword of Burial of Heaven with both hands. He condensed a brilliant golden sword that was tens of thousands of feet long and ruthlessly slashed at the formation. This sword was open and aboveboard, filled with boundless domineering and destructive power. It was such a gorgeous and domineering sword. It did not seem to have any tricks or schemes, but it gave the Imperial Tutor and the others tremendous pressure. As a result, the Imperial Tutor and the soldiers found it difficult to breathe. Their hearts were filled with fear. They knew that this sword could very well destroy the defensive formation, but no one could muster the courage to block it. Kaboom! In the next moment, the golden sword slashed at the 5-colored light barrier within a 100-mile radius, creating an earth-shattering sound. Under everyone's gaze, the supreme-grade king-level defensive light barrier was split in half. In the process of its collapse, the dense cracks on the light barrier exploded, causing the entire light barrier to explode and burst into billions of fragments. Whoosh! The destructive shockwave carried with it endless fragments of divine light and swept in all directions, affecting thousands of soldiers. The Sword of World Annihilation, which had lost more than half of its power, also slashed into the crowd with a loud bang. Fortunately, the Imperial Tutor and the godly generals managed to dodge in time and were not split into pieces. However, more than 2,000 soldiers were killed on the spot. These people were either swept up by the shockwave and shattered into pieces on the spot, or they were struck by the Sword of World Annihilation and crushed into pieces without leaving behind a corpse. In addition to the 2,000 soldiers who were killed, more than 1,000 soldiers were severely injured and were in a miserable state. Even the Imperial Preceptor and a few divine generals were left in a sorry state with ashen faces. Great! Ha ha ha! It's finally broken. Without the protection of the formation, all of you can die. The soldiers of the Rebel Alliance were already prepared. They retreated thousands of miles away and were covered by the fleet, so there were not many casualties. Seeing Ji Tianxing shatter the defensive formation with one strike, more than 10,000 soldiers cheered excitedly and shouted in unison. At this moment, the morale of the soldiers on both sides were greatly reduced. On one hand, they were ashen-faced and full of fear and trepidation. On the other hand, their morale was very high. The more they fought, the braver they became. Chapter 4169. The morale of the Rebel Alliance's army was high, and their battle cries shook the heavens. The more than 9,000 soldiers under the Imperial Tutor's command were trembling with fear. Before the Imperial Tutor gave the order to retreat, many of the soldiers couldn't help but retreat to the Grotto Heaven's entrance. As long as the Imperial Tutor gave the order, they could immediately pass through the space gate and escape back to the Shura Grotto Heaven. The Imperial Tutor certainly knew that the current situation was not suitable for battle. He had to retreat back to the Shura Grotto Heaven and let the soldiers rest for a while to stabilize their morale. Only then could they compete with the Rebel Alliance. However, he couldn't give the order to retreat directly. Otherwise, the more than 9,000 soldiers would panic and rush to the Grotto Heaven's entrance like a swarm of bees. There would definitely be problems. He could only let the soldiers maintain their formation and retreat into the Grotto Heaven in an orderly manner. He and the many divine generals couldn't retreat first. They had to bring up the rear for the soldiers and prevent the Rebel Alliance from pursuing them. How could the Rebel Alliance let go of such a great opportunity? Seeing the Imperial Tutor's soldiers retreating quickly, Ji Tianxing decisively waved his divine sword and gave chase. More than 10,000 soldiers also let out battle cries and used all kinds of divine powers to attack the Imperial Tutor's soldiers. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. Divine light danced in the sky as all kinds of destructive divine arts poured down like a torrential flood, bombarding the Imperial Preceptor and thousands of soldiers. If it was a normal battle, the Imperial Tutor's side would be at a disadvantage, but they could resist and neutralize the attacks with all their might. However, it was different now. The Imperial Tutor's soldiers were in a hurry to escape and didn't have the heart to continue fighting. More than 2,000 people had already escaped back to the Grotto Heaven. Another 2,000 were retreating, and only 5,000 soldiers were casting spells to resist. It wasn't hard to imagine that they wouldn't be able to withstand the fierce attacks of Ji Tianxing and more than 10,000 soldiers. Bang, bang, bang. A series of muffled explosions sounded. Dazzling divine light burst out from the crowd, and deafening loud noises sounded. Many people were blasted into smithereens on the spot. Not even their corpses remained. There were still many soldiers who were lucky enough to survive, but they were heavily injured. Their appearance was extremely miserable, and their combat strength was severely weakened. Fortunately, the imperial tutor and the heavenly generals did their best to cast spells and protect the soldiers as they retreated. Otherwise, their casualties would be even more tragic. In this round of ferocious attacks, another 500 soldiers were killed and close to 1,000 were injured. The imperial tutor was also anxious. He began to urge his subordinates to hurry back to the Azura paradise. Ji Tianxing and the soldiers of the rebel alliance did not stop. They immediately cast powerful spells and launched a second round of fierce attacks on the imperial tutor. The imperial tutor and the divine generals were beaten to a pulp, their injuries worsening. Thousands of soldiers were also beaten into a sorry state. They covered their heads and fled like rats. The number of casualties continued to increase. Finally, 100 breaths had passed. The imperial tutor's subordinates all retreated back to the Azura paradise. Even the imperial tutor and the divine generals who brought up the rear turned around and entered the spatial gate. At this time, the imperial preceptor's 9,000-plus soldiers were only left with around 5,000. At least 4,000 soldiers were killed in the process of retreating, and more than 20 divine kings were taken care of by Ji Tianxing. The imperial tutor's forces were further weakened. Even if they escaped back to the Azura paradise, they did not have much of a chance of winning. Ji Tianxing reckoned that when the anti-rebels alliance breached the entrance of the Grotto Heaven and slaughtered the Shura Grotto Heaven, Emperor Preceptor's trump card would be revealed. After the imperial tutor and the others escaped to the Azura paradise, they hurriedly closed the entrance. The 300 feet tall spatial gate disappeared. In the seemingly empty sky, there was actually an invisible spell formation. If they could crack or break that spell formation, they would be able to enter the Azura paradise. More than 10,000 soldiers were filled with killing intent and high morale. They were about to charge forward and break that spell formation together. However, Ji Tianxing raised his hand to stop them. He could already see that the entrance to the Azura paradise was also a supreme-grade king-level divine array. If more than 10,000 soldiers attacked together, in addition to the 21 divine warships, they could indeed break that spell formation. However, it would take a lot of time, and the amount of divine power it would consume was immeasurable. Ji Tianxing let the soldiers rest while he took the opportunity to treat their injuries. He used the God's Eye mystic technique to carefully observe the invisible spell formation, looking for a way to break it. Although the Azura God Emperor had personally set up the spell formation at the entrance of the Azura paradise, it was very profound and exquisite. However, Ji Tianxing was most proficient in the Sword Dao and the Array Dao, and his attainments in them were also extraordinarily high. After observing for a few minutes, he figured out the structure of the spell formation. He frowned and pondered. After deducing for a few minutes, he found a way to break it. Then, he started to cast spells to break the spell formation. Yun Yarrow, Ji Ku, Bai Feng, and the other god kings were assisting him at any time. It was much easier to find a way to break the spell formation. Originally, Ji Tianxing would have needed a few hours to break this spell formation. However, with the help of so many god kings, he only needed an hour to successfully break a hole in the spell formation. Then, everyone worked together to enlarge that hole by more than 10 times, making it 30,000 feet long and wide. Everyone boarded the divine warships and flew into the Azura paradise under the lead of the god-slaying warships. After the imperial tutor fled back to the Azura paradise with the remaining 5,000 soldiers, he wanted to set up an ambush at the entrance of the Azura paradise. He knew that Kenshin would definitely have a way to break the spell formation at the entrance of the Azura paradise and lead the fleet into the Azura paradise. If he could ambush them at the entrance, he would definitely be able to catch them off guard. However, the problem was that most of the 5,000 soldiers under the imperial tutor were either lightly or heavily injured. Their morale was also very low. In addition, there were 10,000 soldiers guarding the Azura Divine Palace. They could not be easily mobilized. The Azura Divine Palace was the most important. It was the final fortress. He could not afford to lose it. He could not mobilize the 10,000 soldiers. If he wanted to ambush the rebel alliance with just the 5,000 soldiers by his side, it would be no different from sending them to their deaths. With this thought, the imperial tutor dismissed the idea of an ambush. He simply took the 5,000 soldiers and obediently returned to the Azura divine palace. He let the injured soldiers rest and recuperate. Then, he commanded the 10,000 soldiers guarding the Azura divine palace to prepare for war. After arranging all these matters, he thought to himself, these 15,000 soldiers and the spell formation around the Azura divine palace are our final barrier. Success or failure depends on this battle. Thinking of this, he subconsciously turned around and looked at the depths of the Azura divine palace. He silently prayed in his heart, in 6 hours, it will be 49 days. You should be done, right? If something goes wrong today, I'm afraid I won't be able to give you an explanation. I can only become a dead soul under Kenshin's sword. Everything depends on you. The imperial tutor pursed his lips. His expression and mood became very serious. His hand gripped the hilt of his divine sword tightly. He knew that it would take the rebel alliance at least a day to break into the Azura paradise. Even if Kenshin personally took action with the help of many god kings, it would still take several hours. There should be no problem with the top-grade king-level spell formation at the entrance lasting for 6 hours, right? End of chapter. Chapter 4170. In fact, Ji Tianxing, with the help of many god kings, took less than 2 hours to enter the Azura paradise. He originally thought that the imperial tutor would set up traps and ambushes near the entrance of the paradise. This way, even if they couldn't destroy the rebel alliance's fleet, they could still severely injure them. However, the 5,000 soldiers under the imperial tutor were definitely not enough. At the very least, they would need to add the 10,000 soldiers guarding the Azura divine palace. If the imperial tutor was bold enough to do this, he would definitely reap some benefits. As for what the outcome would be, that was unknown. Unfortunately, the imperial tutor was never a bold or crazy person. He was more cautious than ordinary people. Therefore, Ji Tianxing was a little disappointed that he didn't see any ambushes near the entrance of the paradise. However, according to the usual practice, the imperial tutor had set up some traps and formations near the entrance of the paradise in advance. His goal was to create trouble for the rebel alliance and delay them. However, Ji Tianxing was already prepared. He used the Divine Eye secret technique to see through the traps and formations and avoided them one by one. As a result, the rebel alliance was indeed delayed a little, but it didn't matter much. The Azura paradise was very big. It had a vast territory, rich resources, and abundant divine power. There was no need to say much about this. At this time, this beautiful world was filled with a heavy and oppressive atmosphere. Wherever the rebel alliance's fleet passed, there was no living person in sight. Ji Tianxing believed that the imperial tutor must have already dismissed the miscellaneous personnel and those who didn't have any combat strength. As for the imperial tutor's soldiers, they must have gathered near the Azura divine palace, waiting to fight to the death with the rebel alliance. Ji Tianxing wasn't in a hurry. The god-slaying battleship led the 20 battleships and advanced at a moderate pace, heading straight for the Azura divine palace. During the 400,000-mile journey, they naturally encountered many traps and ambushes. These were all set up by the imperial tutor a few months ago. Back then, the imperial tutor had already predicted that this day would come. However, Ji Tianxing was always able to detect danger in advance and cleverly avoid it. Half an hour later, the fleet arrived safely at the Azura divine palace. It was a group of palaces with a radius of 1,000 miles. There were more than 60 lofty mountains, and each mountain peak had palaces and residences. They were all luxuriously built. The main peak in the middle was also the most majestic peak. The palace at the top of the mountain was the most majestic and sacred. That was the Azura divine palace. The Rebel Alliance's fleet stopped 1,000 miles away from the palace complex. This was because the group of palaces had already activated the mountain protection formation, which covered a radius of 1,000 miles, and enveloped the dozens of mountains. This incomparably exquisite protective array was the most critical barrier of the Azura Divine Palace. It was a genuine top-grade king-level divine array. The 7-foot-thick dark red light barrier had endless blood flowing around it, releasing a soaring killing intent and a sharp aura. There were also 12,000 fully armed soldiers guarding the edge of the great array, glaring at the Rebel Alliance's fleet. The other 3,000 soldiers had suffered heavy injuries. They were the group that had retreated from the heavenly grotto entrance. At this moment, they were treating their injuries in the palace. The Imperial Tutor and the 9 divine generals stood in the air above the Azura Divine Palace's square, looking at the Rebel Alliance's fleet. At this point, this was the final battle. Both sides didn't waste any words and directly started fighting. The 21 battleships of the Rebel Alliance all activated their attack formations, crazily accumulating their divine power, and releasing an overwhelming barrage of cannon fire and pillars of divine power. Bang! 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 Deafening explosions erupted, resounding through the horizon. The dense pillars of light that filled the sky like a rain of arrows also ruthlessly bombarded the dark red mountain protection formation. Countless pillars of divine power exploded, bursting into millions of fragments of divine light. The dark red light barrier that spanned 1,000 miles shook violently, flashing with divine light. The cannon fire of the 20 high-grade king-level god battleships didn't damage the mountain protection formation. At most, they could only consume its energy. Only the several hundred pillars of light released by the god-slaying battleships managed to create several dozen cracks on the dark red light barrier. However, the light barrier was simply too thick, so a few cracks didn't matter. The Rebel Alliance's first round of attacks couldn't even shake the mountain protection formation. The 10,000 soldiers inside the formation laughed at them. The Imperial Tutor waved his hand and gave the order for a counterattack. Thus, several hundred soldiers used their arts to control the mountain protection formation, releasing divine light that blotted out the sky and smashed into the Rebel Alliance's fleet like a flood. The reason why they used the mountain protection formation to counterattack and didn't let the 10,000 soldiers attack was to preserve their strength. The Imperial Tutor knew that no matter how strong the Rebel Alliance was, they wouldn't be able to do anything to the mountain protection formation in the short term. He could use the mountain protection formation's power to consume the Rebel Alliance's strength. In addition, even if the 11,000 soldiers attacked with all their strength, they wouldn't be able to defeat the Rebel Alliance. It would be a waste of energy. It was better to stall for time and wait for that trump card to appear before fighting the Rebel Alliance to the death. That was the wiser move. The Imperial Tutor's move was indeed effective. More than 10,000 soldiers remained in a spectating state, and only a few hundred soldiers controlled the mountain protection formation. They successfully stalled the Rebel Alliance. The 21 god battleships attacked with all their might, expending countless resources, and continuously releasing cannon fire and pillars of light to bombard the mountain protection formation. However, the mountain protection formation wasn't damaged. At most, the god-slaying battleships only managed to create some cracks. No matter how much the mountain protection formation shook and trembled, it was extremely safe inside the formation. There was no danger at all. The more than 10,000 soldiers under the Imperial Tutor's command laughed even more arrogantly when they saw the Rebel Alliance's fleet bombarding the mountain protection formation to no avail. They mocked the Rebel Alliance without restraint, and their morale rose as well. They felt much more at ease. The mountain protection formation gave them a sense of security that was far more effective than the Imperial Tutor's empty slogans. Just like that, the two sides were in a stalemate for about 15 minutes. The 21 god battleships of the Rebel Alliance continuously bombarded the mountain protection formation more than 100,000 times, consuming at least 200 billion worth of resources. Fortunately, Ji Tianxing was now the richest person in the world and had hundreds of trillions worth of resources. That was why he could withstand such consumption. Unfortunately, even after consuming so many cultivation resources, they didn't achieve any results. The mountain protection formation was still intact. Even though there were many cracks and dents on its surface, it wasn't really broken. Under the control of hundreds of soldiers, the cracks and dents on the surface of the mountain protection formation were also slowly being repaired. At most, after half a day, those cracks and dents would disappear, and the mountain protection formation would be restored to its original state. This made Ji Tianqing a little depressed. He could already tell that the Imperial Tutor wanted to stall for time and weaken the Rebel Alliance's combat power before finding an opportunity to counterattack. Since that was the case, he definitely couldn't let the Imperial Tutor get what he wanted. Thus, he decisively ordered the fleet to stop attacking and let the soldiers rest for a while. Then, he asked the White Dragon to increase the power of the god-slaying battleships to the maximum and attack the mountain protection formation at all costs, concentrating on one point. He also held the Sword of Burial of Heaven and the Divine Hammer and attacked personally. End of chapter. Chapter 41-71. Sword Rain. Before the Imperial Tutor could react, Ji Tianqing flew high into the sky, pointed his sword at the sky, and let out an angry roar. He used all his strength and used his ultimate skill, vowing to break the protective formation as soon as possible. Dazzling starlight immediately lit up in the sky. 90,000 starlight dots appeared. The densely packed stars poured down like a meteor shower, bringing with them a terrifying power that could destroy the heavens and earth. Within the protective formation, the 10,000 soldiers were discussing and mocking. Why did the Rebel Alliance's fleet stop attacking? At this moment, they saw the god-slaying battleship attacking the formation alone, and Kenshin was personally attacking. Everyone stopped mocking and sneering, and they sized up Kenshin with curiosity and vigilance. Everyone had heard of the sword god's fame and his terrifying strength and methods. It was only at this moment that they truly witnessed the sword god's most proficient sword technique. Countless people looked up at the sky and saw the dazzling stars in the sky, and they were shocked. In the next moment, they saw clearly that the 90,000 light spots falling from the sky were not stars. They were 90,000 giant swords of stars. Each giant sword was thousands of feet long, and they were condensed and contained supreme divine power that could destroy everything. The sword rain had not yet arrived, but the 10,000 soldiers could already feel the terrifying divine power and the terrifying sword intent. At this moment, they'd experienced exactly how formidable the sword god was. Everyone's expression became serious and grave, and their hearts were also in their mouths, and they were filled with deep worry. Previously, they had been very confident in the protective formation, but now they could not help but feel worried and apprehensive. Could this invincible protective mountain array really block the sword god's ultimate sword technique? Just as the soldiers were in a daze, the Imperial Tutor came back to his senses and was also shocked. He shouted anxiously, "What are you waiting for? Quickly, everyone, work together to support the formation." To be on the safe side, the Imperial Tutor had no choice but to order all the soldiers to use their arts to increase the power of the protective formation. The protective formation was too important, and there could not be any mistakes. More than 10,000 soldiers came to their senses and hurriedly cast spells to increase the power of the protective formation. Unfortunately, they were still one step too slow. Boom 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 boom. In the next instant, the 90,000 stellar swords slammed into the dark red protective formation with boundless divine might. An earth-shattering explosion erupted. It was deafening, and it spread for tens of thousands of miles. The huge mountain guarding formation was immediately submerged by the boundless starlight. When it suffered the terrifying impact, it also shook violently. Previously, cracks and dents had appeared in the mountain protecting array. The god-slaying battleship had also concentrated its firepower on the damaged area. At this moment, the Rain of Swords was also under Ji Tianqing's control, deliberately bombarding that area repeatedly. Thus, amidst a series of loud rumbles, everyone clearly heard a burst of catcha-catcha shattering sound. The soldiers who were channeling their arts and injecting divine power into the protective formation subconsciously looked up. Then, they saw a frightening scene. Under the continuous bombardment of the 90,000 giant swords, the incomparably thick protective mountain formation was actually densely packed with cracks in an area of 10,000 zhong in radius. The cracks were rapidly spreading, deepening, and thickening. There were even dark red fragments of divine light bursting out. When the 90,000 star swords finished their first bombardment, the center of the fissure that was tens of thousands of feet wide had clearly caved in. The thousands of cracks also gradually gathered together, leaving only a few hundred cracks. At this moment, The cracks were basically tens of thousands of feet long and dozens of feet wide. Everyone's gaze could already see the sky outside through those cracks. Without a doubt, the protective formation that was said to be invincible had finally been breached. It was just that the cracked area had not collapsed yet, so there were no huge gaps or holes. But everyone knew that it was only a matter of time. Quickly cast spells to support the formation and repair the cracks. The Imperial Tutor's expression changed immediately. He anxiously roared and hurriedly cast spells to control the formation. More than 10,000 soldiers panicked. All of them channeled their divine power into the protective formation without caring about anything else. Although everyone tried their best to increase the strength of the formation and repair the cracks and holes, the speed of the formation was too slow. However, the speed of repair was simply too slow, far slower than the speed of destruction. After the first round of bombardment, only a little more than 20,000 of the 90,000 starry swords had exploded. There were still more than 60,000 stellar swords left, and they actually formed a huge sword formation in the sky, and continued to bombard the broken area. Whoosh whoosh whoosh. The sword lights flew back and forth as fast as lightning, emitting sharp whistling sounds. Bam bam bam. The stellar swords kept bombarding the cracked area, causing a series of loud, dull sounds and splashes of starlight and red light to fill the sky. Clearly, the stellar swords were constantly shattering and dissipating. But the cracked area was also constantly expanding, sinking, and splashing divine light fragments. Everyone saw with their own eyes that the cracks in the area were rapidly expanding, and gaps and holes were gradually appearing. Such an outcome caused the soldiers under the Imperial Preceptor to be filled with worry and anxiety. On the other hand, the 10,000 soldiers of the Rebel Alliance were excited and spirited. They saw the hope of victory again. At this time, Ji Tianqing waved the divine hammer again and smashed out 98 beams of divine light continuously at the cracked area. Boom, boom, boom. Another loud explosion could be heard. That region began to shatter at an even faster rate, and even more fragments of divine light splashed out. The power of the formation was weakening, and the thickness of the light wall was decreasing. The gaps and holes were also getting bigger and bigger. As Ji Tianqing raised the sword of burial of heaven, he absorbed the power of the five elements world and slashed out a sword of annihilation. At this moment, not only the Imperial Tutor's pupils constricted, but his face was also full of shock. Even the 10,000+ soldiers under his command felt their hearts skip a beat as their expressions changed drastically. Boom. Crack. The next moment, an earth-shattering sound burst out. Under everyone's watchful eyes, the sword of annihilation struck the protective mountain array and split the cracked area into millions of pieces. Countless dark red divine light fragments splashed out, and a huge gap with a radius of 10,000 feet appeared. Violent and devastating shock waves crashed into the protective mountain array, causing it to shake violently. The 11,000 soldiers in the array were also swept up by the shock waves. They were thrown off their feet and screamed in agony. Just like that, the Imperial Tutor's strongest barrier, the protective mountain array, was broken. At the same time, a few hundred soldiers were unlucky enough to be swept up by the shockwaves and died on the spot. Next, Ji Tianqing didn't need to give any orders. The 21 divine warships, which had been ready for a long time, unleashed all their cannons and light beams toward the gap in the protective mountain array. Boom boom boom. Following a series of loud noises, the gap doubled in size, and countless cracks appeared around it. In this way, it was impossible for the Imperial Tutor and his soldiers to repair the protective mountain array. Chapter 4172. Kill. The protective array has been broken. Kill them all. Victory belongs to us. The boundless heaven continent belongs to us. The protective array had been broken, causing the morale of the Rebel Alliance's soldiers to soar. They shouted excitedly, wanting to rush out of the divine warships and charge into the protective array to kill all the soldiers under the Imperial Tutor. Then, the army would occupy the Azura Divine Palace and declare victory. However, Ji Tianqing did not give the order, and the soldiers would not act on their own. They still followed the order, holding their weapons tightly and waiting patiently. The 21 divine warships were not in a hurry to rush into the protective array. They were still thousands of miles away from the array, constantly firing cannons and light beams. With every breath, thousands of cannons and light beams would pass through the gap in the protective array and blast toward the Imperial tutor and the tens of thousands of soldiers. Ji Tianqing's goal was obvious. First, he would use the warship's cannons to kill the Imperial tutor and his soldiers from a distance, further weakening the enemy's strength. When the enemy had suffered heavy casualties and their combat strength was weak, he would send the Rebel Alliance's army to charge into the protective array. By doing so, he could effectively preserve the strength of his side and reduce casualties. However, the disadvantage was also obvious, and that was that it consumed too many cultivation resources. However, Ji Tianqing controlled almost the entire boundless heaven continent and carried hundreds of trillions worth of resources with him. He did not care about this consumption at all. Boom, 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 boom. The cannons fired continuously, and the loud sounds echoed between heaven and earth. Inside the protective formation, the Imperial Preceptor and his subordinates were suffering unspeakably. Seeing that the protective array had been breached and the gap had expanded to a radius of 20 miles, the Imperial tutor could only give the order to give up. He took the lead to use his ultimate skill and joined forces with the 11,000 soldiers to resist the bombardment of the anti-rebel fleet. Unfortunately, their strength was limited. At most, they could block and neutralize 80% of the cannons. In the end, 20% of the cannons and light beams would bombard the crowd, causing many casualties. With every breath, dozens of soldiers would be killed on the spot. It was a scene of flesh and blood flying in all directions. The area within a radius of 1,000 miles was drowned in dazzling divine light. As the Imperial tutor held on, he repeatedly turned back to look at the Azura divine palace. He anxiously muttered in his heart, "We can't hold on any longer. Why haven't you made a move yet?" However, the powerhouse he was relying on didn't seem to hear his prayers. There was no response from the Azura divine palace. 100 breaths of time quickly passed. At this moment, more than half of the mountains and forests within 1,000 miles of the protective formation had been destroyed. At least 100 palaces and residences were blown into ruins by the overwhelming cannon fire and pillars of light. Only half of the palaces were protected by defensive formations and could still hold on. However, there was no doubt that the palaces and mountains protected by the formation would not be able to hold on for long and would eventually turn into dust. The Imperial tutor and many of the god kings were injured, and over 2,000 of the 11,000 soldiers were killed. Only 9,000 soldiers were still bitterly holding on. However, their combat strength was rapidly weakening as they were forced to retreat by the overwhelming cannon fire. The Imperial tutor's heart was burning with anxiety. He could only order the 3,000 soldiers who were hiding in the palace to treat their injuries to join the battle. These 12,000 soldiers were the last of the Imperial tutor's forces. If these soldiers were also killed, then he would have no soldiers to use. At that time, even if that trump card appeared, he would be powerless to reverse the situation and would not be able to defeat the Rebel Alliance. After all, the Rebel Alliance still had more than 16,000 soldiers. Moreover, they were in peak condition and had ample combat strength. Boom, boom, boom. The anti-rebel fleet's cannon fire continued. The soldiers operating the divine warships had never been so happy and excited as they were at this moment. Inside the protective formation, palaces and residences were destroyed one after another, and batches of the Azura God Emperor's minions were killed. They were in high spirits. Another 100 breaths of time passed. The Imperial tutor and the divine generals were in an even more sorry state. They were all covered in wounds and their hair was disheveled. 2,000 of the 12,000 soldiers had also been killed. Only 10,000 soldiers were left. The Imperial tutor knew that he could not continue fighting like this. In at most an hour, the last 10,000 soldiers would be completely wiped out. Therefore, he could only lead the 10,000 soldiers to retreat as they fought and retreated toward the Azura Divine Palace. Seeing this, the Rebel Alliance's fleet was not in a hurry to chase after them. Under the command of Ji Tianqing, they first concentrated their firepower on the protective formation and further widened the gap. In a short while, half of the protective formation was destroyed. The remaining half of the dark red light barrier also collapsed and dissipated into the air. The protective formation was completely destroyed. Even if the Azura God Emperor came personally, he would not be able to repair it in a short time. Ji Tianxing was finally relieved and ordered all the soldiers to attack. Swish, swish, swish. 15,000 soldiers of various races rushed out of the 20 divine warships. 200 to 300 people stayed behind on each divine warship. They were responsible for controlling the divine warships and continuing to suppress the Imperial Tutor's army with firepower. Ji Tianxing, the patriarchs, and the powerhouses led the 15,000 soldiers and steadily approached the Azura Divine Palace. Seeing that the Imperial Preceptor and his soldiers had lost their barrier, they suffered heavy casualties in the sky filled with cannon fire, and their numbers decreased sharply. They could only escape into the final fortress, the Azura Divine Palace. The Azura Divine Palace was protected by 2 layers of top-grade divine arrays. Its defensive power was stronger than the protective formation and more difficult to destroy. The Imperial Tutor calculated that as long as they hid in the Azura Divine Palace and supported the protective formation with all their strength, they would be able to delay for a few hours. As for after a few hours, if their trump card did not appear, they could only perish. With this thought in mind, the Imperial Tutor personally cast a spell and opened the gates of the Azura Divine Palace. Ka, the 1,000-foot-tall bronze gates slowly opened. The Imperial Tutor and his soldiers were about to cross the gates and rush into the Azura Divine Palace. At this moment, a boundless blood-colored torrent suddenly surged out from the spacious hall behind the gates. Shua! The blood-colored torrent surged out, carrying with it a boundless divine might and bloody intent. It flew into the air above the square outside the divine palace. Under the gazes of more than 20,000 people, this 10,000-foot-long torrent of blood-colored torrent twisted and condensed in the air, quickly condensing into a human figure. Divine light flashed and bloody flames rose. A 1,000-foot-tall divine spirit with 6 blood-colored wings on its back appeared in front of everyone. This blood-red divine spirit was covered in pitch-black armor formed from the aura of death, covering 80% of its body. It had a massive head, long purple hair, and 6 blood-colored wings. It also had a ferocious and majestic face. Like a huge mountain, he hovered over the square, gazing at the soldiers of the Anti-Rebellious League with an expressionless face. Suddenly, the 15,000 soldiers felt a surge of pressure. Fear and awe rose in their hearts, and they couldn't help but stop in their tracks. The Imperial Tutor and his soldiers all revealed expressions of surprise and disbelief. They let out earth-shattering cheers. Chapter 4173. His Majesty the God Emperor. His Majesty the God Emperor has returned. Greetings, His Majesty the God Emperor. At this moment, the Imperial Tutor and the nearly 10,000 soldiers under his command all exclaimed in excitement and disbelief. Everyone was excited and pleasantly surprised, and they could not help but shout. A moment ago, they were still worried, anxious, and desperate. But now, their hanging hearts had all settled back into their stomachs, and they smiled as if they had been relieved of a heavy burden and had survived a disaster. The battle was not over yet, and the outcome of the battle was still uncertain. But in the hearts of these 10,000 soldiers, they had already won, and they were safe, because their supreme overlord, the Azura God Emperor, had returned. In their knowledge, only the Azura God Emperor was truly invincible. Although Kenshin was powerful and terrifying, he could not be compared to the Azura God Emperor. That's right, that giant black-armored god thousands of feet tall was like the Grim Reaper who controlled hell. He was the famous Azura God Emperor. Ever since the Azura God Emperor ruled the boundless heaven continent, he had handed over the power to the Imperial Tutor and the Meng Shuai. And he was obsessed with studying the mystery of the grey fog in the outer void, and he almost never asked about the boundless heaven continent's affairs, and he basically never showed his face. Even so, there were statues of him in every city on the boundless heaven continent. Therefore, as long as it was a citizen of the boundless heaven continent, there was no one who did not know the Azura God Emperor. While the Emperor's preceptor and the 10,000 soldiers were cheering, the 15,000 soldiers of the Anti-Rebels Alliance were also dumbfounded. The 20 divine warships stopped attacking, and the soldiers operating the divine warships were stunned. Even the white dragon was stunned. It paused for a moment before continuing to release cannon fire and light pillars. The 15,000 soldiers of the 20 ancient clans and sects were also stunned in place, staring at the Azura God Emperor with their mouths agape. Everyone's eyes widened and their faces turned ugly. Deep fear was hidden in their eyes. In fact, many of the Divine Lord Realm experts who were slightly less courageous had their heads bowed, their faces ashen. They couldn't withstand the killing intent and pressure of the Azura God Emperor. As the saying goes, a person's name is like a tree's shadow. The 5 God Emperors were supreme and invincible gods in the eyes of all living beings in the God realm. This concept, after thousands of years of accumulation, had long been deeply rooted. Even if these 15,000 soldiers had followed the powerful Kenshin and won every battle, they would never have been defeated. However, the appearance of the Azura God Emperor filled their hearts with fear and despair. It was as if they were witnessing the descent of death. It couldn't be helped. In everyone's subconscious, there was a conclusion. Although Kenshin was strong, he was still no match for the Azura God Emperor. At the very least, the current Kenshin wasn't qualified yet. Therefore, the faces of the 20 patriarchs and sect leaders were very ugly, and they were also very guilty. They had already expected that today's ending would be rewritten. All their previous victories would be overturned. The Rebel Alliance was on the verge of conquering the Azura Divine Palace and completely controlling the boundless Heaven continent. However, with the appearance of the Azura God Emperor, the Imperial Tutor would be able to make a comeback. That's right. To the Imperial Preceptor and the 10,000 soldiers under his command, this was a reversal of the situation. When the Azura God Emperor appeared, Ji Tianxing subconsciously stopped in his tracks and frowned as he stared at the other party. At this time, a thought flashed through his mind. As I expected, the Imperial Tutor's final trump card can only be the Azura God Emperor. In fact, this was a very simple question without any suspense. Even the God Generals and God Kings under the Imperial Tutor felt a sense of realization when they saw the Azura God Emperor appear. Hearing the Imperial Tutor and the soldiers shouting the name of the Azura God Emperor and saluting with fanaticism, Ji Tianxing raised his eyebrows. He used the Divine Eye secret technique and stared at the Azura God Emperor, carefully observing and analyzing. At first, he was also a little shocked, thinking that the Azura God Emperor's original body had returned. If that was the case, then he didn't have the confidence to defeat the Azura God Emperor. However, he still thought that it was unlikely. In the eyes of the Azura God Emperor, the mystery of the grey fog in the outer space was definitely more important than the boundless Heaven continent. And the facts proved that Ji Tianxing's analysis was completely correct. After careful observation, he discovered that the Azura God Emperor in front of him was not the original body, but an avatar. However, this avatar was a little strange. It seemed to have been refined using some sort of refining and sacrificial method, so that this avatar was very similar to the original body, and there were almost no flaws. Because of this, except for the Imperial Tutor, the tens of thousands of soldiers all thought that the Azura God Emperor's original body had returned. Now that he was sure that this was the Azura God Emperor's avatar, Ji Tianxing breathed a sigh of relief. He didn't have much confidence in dealing with the Azura God Emperor's original body. However, he was confident in dealing with an avatar, even if it was a specially enhanced version. At this moment, the Azura God Emperor looked down at Ji Tianxing and spoke. Long Tian, you didn't think that this emperor would be waiting for you here, did you? The Azura God Emperor's voice was deep like muffled thunder, and it reverberated between heaven and earth, containing a powerful aura and intimidation. However, Ji Tianxing stood proudly in front of him, and his aura were not suppressed in the slightest. Is it that hard to guess? For nearly half a year, the Imperial Tutor has no one he can use, and he hasn't made any moves or plans. He's been waiting for death. However, he's not in a hurry, and he looks as if he has a card up his sleeve. I can guess that you must have informed him that you'll be back at the critical moment. Otherwise, how could he have been so calm? The Azura God Emperor frowned, and his crimson eyes flashed with a cold sneer. Ha, that's true. If you can't even analyze this, then you don't deserve to be called a Kenshin. You've been invincible for the past year, and you've conquered 99 domains. But now that this emperor has returned, Everything you've done will be for naught. You're a smart person, and you should know that you've already lost. Stop wasting time, admit defeat and surrender. The Azura God Emperor stared at Ji Tianxing, and his calm voice carried an unquestionable domineering tone. Ji Tianxing chuckled. If your true body had returned, perhaps you would have the right to say such words. But you've only sent an avatar back, and you want to make a comeback. You underestimate this emperor too much, and overestimate yourself too much. You should know very well that the avatars of the other fellows have already been destroyed by this emperor. And your avatar will meet the same fate. Ji Tianxing's voice wasn't loud, but it was full of energy and confidence, and it spread clearly across the battlefield. Hearing his words, the 10,000 soldiers under the imperial tutor were stunned, and their excitement dissipated. Many of them revealed looks of astonishment. It's not the true body of His Majesty the God Emperor, but an avatar? This thought flashed through the minds of the 10,000 soldiers, and they were somewhat disappointed. The 16,000 soldiers of the Rebel Alliance were also stunned for a moment, and then they breathed a sigh of relief, and their expressions relaxed. It's not the true body, but an avatar? That's good, we still have a chance. End of chapter. Chapter 4174. The arrival of the Azura God Emperor himself and the arrival of his avatar were two completely different concepts. Many God Kings understood that the avatar of the Azura God Emperor only had about 10% of the original strength. Avatars could move freely and were not restricted by distance, making them very convenient to use. The 5 God Emperors would all refine avatars to take the place of their original bodies and handle affairs. Although the avatar only had 10% of the original strength, it was still a bona fide God Emperor, far surpassing the God King realm. Even a peak God King would have no chance of victory against the avatar of the God Emperor. But the current situation was different. Although Ji Tianxing was a peak God King, his true fighting strength had long surpassed the God King realm. In everyone's view, his strength was already very close to the God Emperor realm, and there was not much of a difference between him and the 5 God Emperors. One could well imagine that the avatar of the Azura God Emperor was most likely no match for Ji Tianxing. Thus, the Imperial Tutor's soldiers were somewhat disappointed, their morale low, and their hearts filled with worry. As for the more than 10,000 soldiers of the Rebel Alliance, the worry and fear in their hearts dissipated, and they all breathed a sigh of relief. Everyone was filled with anticipation, waiting to see the battle between Ji Tianxing and the avatar of the Azura God Emperor. Everyone had heard that Kenshin had killed several avatars of the God Emperor before returning to the God realm. But that was only hearsay. No one had seen it with their own eyes, and no one had heard the details of the battle, so they had no idea. But today was different. Everyone present was blessed with the opportunity to witness a battle between supreme gods with their own eyes. How could they not be excited, agitated, and expectant? Seeing everyone's reaction, the avatar of the Azura God Emperor sneered, his eyes full of contempt. Long Tien, in truth, this emperor returned to the boundless heaven continent 50 days ago. Do you know why this emperor waited until today to appear? This sudden sentence caused everyone present to be stunned for a moment. Ji Tianxing also frowned as he stared at the Azura God Emperor's incarnation. Immediately, he guessed something and replied with a sneer, "You returned to the boundless heaven continent 50 days ago, but you didn't dare to make a move against me. It's nothing more than knowing your own limitations and knowing that you're not my match. Therefore, in these 50 days, you used some kind of crooked method to refine your incarnation to become even more powerful. Only then would you have the confidence to deal with me." The external incarnation of an emperor god expert was like a divine weapon or an item. The avatars could not cultivate or comprehend divine techniques, and their divine power could not be recovered quickly. Therefore, there was no way to increase their battle prowess. However, the Azura God Emperor treated his avatar as a divine tool. He used certain sacrificial techniques to strengthen his avatar and add some power to it. During these 49 days, the Azura God Emperor's incarnation had remained in the depths of the divine palace, refining the blood soul altar. For this, the Azura God Emperor had spent more than $1 trillion worth of cultivation resources and sacrificed the lives of 98,000 heavenly god. Those 98,000 heavenly gods were all citizens of the boundless heaven continent. Half of them were Protoss, and the other half were foreign races. As early as half a year ago, the Imperial Tutor had received the Azura God Emperor's message in order to carry out this mission in secret. The Imperial Tutor had sent his most trusted subordinates and generals to various regions to secretly search for suitable targets. Half of the 98,000 heavenly gods to be sacrificed were men and women. 20% of them were boys and 20% of them were old men. In addition, the attributes of these people's divine power, aptitude, and bloodline levels also had corresponding requirements. All in all, it was not easy to find 98,000 qualified sacrificial offerings, and to do it secretly without any information being leaked. Only an expert like the Imperial Preceptor, who controlled the entire continent and had immense power, could do it quietly. If it were any other faction, they could not do it secretly. The Azura God Emperor looked down at Ji Tianqing and the Rebel Alliance soldiers and sneered with murderous intent. In these 49 days, 98,000 heavenly gods have completed the sacrifice in the Blood Soul altar, offering their blood souls and power to me. Although this is only one of my incarnations, after the Blood Soul sacrifice, its power has increased by 5 times, and it now has 50% of my strength. Long Tien, and those ants behind you. Now, do you understand my good intentions? Ha ha ha. Stop resisting stubbornly. Admit defeat and accept this Emperor's judgment. The majestic voice spread throughout the battlefield, and the domineering and majestic aura caused everyone's expression to change. The 10,000 soldiers under the Imperial Tutor's command were overjoyed, and their confidence was restored. Their eyes shone brightly. On the other hand, the Rebel Alliance soldiers were frowning, and their faces were solemn and filled with worry. Only Ji Tianqing's expression did not change. He looked at the Azura God Emperor indifferently and said in a cold voice, "It's just a crooked path, and it won't last long. Even if this incarnation has 50% of your strength, so what? I will destroy you today, and see how much of your so-called 50% strength is fake." The Azura God Emperor frowned and snorted. He waved his sharp black claws and gave the order to attack. Kill them all, leave no one alive. The Azura God Emperor's order sounded a little strange. The 10,000 soldiers under the Imperial Tutor's command were at a disadvantage. How could they kill the 10,000 soldiers of the Rebel Alliance without leaving a single one alive? It sounded like a fool's dream. However, the Azura God Emperor's incarnation was present, and after the Blood Soul sacrifice, it had 50% of his strength. This gave the 10,000 soldiers great confidence and courage. Hearing the Azura God Emperor's order, the Imperial Tutor led the 10,000 soldiers and bravely launched a charge. Ji Tianqing also waved the Sword of Burial of Heaven and pointed it at the Azura God Emperor and his soldiers. He roared, "Kill!" The 10,000 soldiers of the Rebel Alliance immediately roared and waved their swords, and the Kenshin soldiers launched an all-out attack. The fleet led by the god-slaying battleship also released the most violent cannon fire, and launched a fierce bombardment at the Azura Divine Palace. This earth-shattering battle, which could be called the grandest and most spectacular in the past 1,000 years, had finally begun. Hundreds of millions of dazzling divine techniques covered tens of thousands of miles of heaven and earth, causing the area to become colorful and chaotic. Tens of thousands of divine techniques bloomed with dazzling light, bursting with destructive power. They fiercely collided between heaven and earth, and the explosion shook the 9 heavens. Pitilessly violent shockwaves, wrapped in endless fragments of divine light, spread out in all directions, destroying everything. In a short moment, everything within 100,000 miles was reduced to a wasteland and ruins. There was only a lonely Azura Divine Palace left on the battlefield, as well as more than 20,000 soldiers from both sides. They were fighting with their lives on the line. Chapter 4175. On the battlefield, soldiers faced soldiers and generals faced generals. The 15,000 soldiers of the Anti-Rebels League besieged the 10,000 soldiers under Emperor Preceptor's command without any regard for their own safety. The God King experts of the 20 ancient clans and sects engaged in a fierce battle against the 100 or so God Kings under the Imperial Preceptor. Nangong Buhua, clan leader Wanyan, Dugu Zhon, Lan Wuji, Jiang Chuyun, Shu Balian, and the others were all at the 9th level of the God King realm. These 10 clan leaders and sect leaders joined forces to besiege the imperial tutor. Ji Tianxing's target was naturally the strongest person present, the Azura God Emperor. Ji Ku, Yun Yarrow, Ji Wuhan, and the others also fought bravely on the battlefield. They took care of each other and formed battle formations. They advanced and retreated appropriately, constantly killing batch after batch of the imperial tutor's soldiers. With the protection of a supreme-grade king-grade divine artifact, they were invincible. Apart from a peak god king like the imperial tutor, almost no one could do anything to them. However, the Azura God Emperor was entangled by Ji Tianxing, and the imperial tutor was held back by the 10 clan leaders and sect leaders. He couldn't spare any time to help. Thus, from the very beginning of this great battle, the situation had been one-sided. The 10,000 soldiers under the imperial tutor were slaughtered. They couldn't break through the encirclement of the rebel alliance at all. They were forced to retreat continuously, and could only hide in the Azura Divine Palace. Even so, their numbers were greatly reduced, and their morale was getting lower and lower. The fleet led by the god-slaying warships continued to bombard the Azura Divine Palace with their cannons. The supreme-grade king-grade divine arrays of the Azura Divine Palace were all activated and operated at full power. With the support of almost endless cultivation resources, the 2 supreme-grade king-grade divine arrays could last for at least a few years. However, the continuous bombardment of the 21 god-slaying warships, the aftershocks of the battle, and the fierce attacks of the 10,000 soldiers were still too much for the 2 arrays to bear. After a quarter of an hour of battle, the first layer of the Azura Divine Palace's defensive array formation began to crack. The defensive power of the array formation had clearly declined. After the battle lasted for 45 minutes, about 5,000 of the 10,000 soldiers under the imperial tutor's command had been killed. Of the 5,000 survivors, they were also severely wounded. They retreated into the Azura Divine Palace, not daring to rush out again. They relied on the defensive array formation of the Azura Divine Palace to tenaciously resist the attacks of the Rebel Alliance, trying to stall for time. With just the few of them, it was impossible for them to win. The imperial tutor was also besieged by the 10 clan leaders and clan masters. He was badly wounded and could barely take care of himself. It was impossible for him to turn the situation around. Hence, the 5,000 soldiers placed all their hopes of turning the tables on Emperor God Xiu Luo. At this time, the Shura God Emperor and Ji Tianxing had exchanged tens of thousands of blows in the sky. The heavenly grotto was already riddled with holes and was on the verge of collapse. They had already moved 500,000 miles away from the battlefield. The sky of this 500,000 miles was filled with pitch-black cracks and holes in the void. One could clearly see the stars in the sky. Terrifying void turbulence and storms poured into the heavenly grotto from these cracks and holes, wreaking havoc everywhere. The mountains, rivers, and forests within the heavenly grotto were destroyed and annihilated by the void storms. Even though the will of heavenly Tao was slowly repairing the cracks and holes in the void, it could not keep up with the speed of destruction. Therefore, the Azura God Emperor's heavenly grotto would soon shatter and completely disintegrate. As for Ji Tianxing and the Azura God Emperor, they had already left the heavenly grotto and moved to the void. 4 powerhouses of their realm and level, it was no longer suitable for them to fight in the divine world. No matter where they were in the divine world, as long as they fought with all their strength, the heavens and earth would shatter and space would collapse, creating a great disaster. Only the vast and boundless void was suitable for them to fight. In the void millions of miles away from the divine world, Ji Tianxing and the Azura God Emperor's avatar were facing each other in the void. Separated by tens of thousands of miles, the 2 stared at each other, locking onto each other's aura, but neither acted rashly. Before this, the 2 had already exchanged tens of thousands of blows and exhausted a great deal of their divine power. At this time, the 2 of them were silently adjusting their breathing and treating their injuries. That's right, both of them had suffered heavy injuries. Ji Tianxing's white robe was already tattered and stained with golden blood. His long hair was also disheveled, and there were more than 20 wounds on his body. Half of them were so deep that his bones could be seen. However, he was expressionless, as if he did not feel pain, and did not even frown. He held the divine hammer in his left hand, which was surrounded by purple lightning, and the sword of burial of heaven in his right hand. The blade was stained with purple blood and flickered with dark red flames. The purple blood naturally belonged to the Asura God Emperor's avatar. The 10,000 feet tall Asura God Emperor's avatar was also hunched over and panting heavily. His thick and muscular arms, as well as his bulging chest and back, had more than 10 crisscrossing wounds. It was a ghastly sight. 2 of the 6 Asura wings on his back had also been pierced, and purple blood flowed continuously. At this time, he had used a secret skill that temporarily increased his combat strength. His entire body was surrounded by purple flames and a layer of dark red killing intent. The 2 of them had fought for so long, and both of them had won and lost. Their injuries were also similar, and neither of them had the upper hand. This result was within Ji Tianqing's expectations, but it was beyond the Asura God Emperor's expectations. His face was ferocious, and his eyes were cold as he stared at Ji Tianqing. He said in a low voice, "Long Tian, how many years has it been since you came back from the dead? Not only have you returned to the peak of the Divine King realm, but you are also several times stronger than before. Such rapid growth is truly unbelievable." Before this, the Asura God Emperor already knew that Ji Tianqing had killed several God Emperor's avatars. After all, these God Emperor's true bodies were in the depths of the void, surrounded by the grey fog. They maintained contact with each other, especially when facing a common enemy like the Kenshin. Naturally, they would exchange information. Therefore, before the Asura God Emperor returned to the divine world, he did not underestimate Ji Tianqing in the slightest. He originally thought that after the Blood Soul sacrifice, his avatar's strength would increase by 4 to 5 times, and he would have the confidence to kill Ji Tianqing. But now, he realized that Ji Tianqing's growth was terrifying. It was obvious that he was several times stronger than before he returned to the divine world. This left the Asura God Emperor with no choice but to consider a question. "Long Tian, I have no choice but to consider this carefully. What kind of treasure in this world could allow you to grow so quickly?" The Asura God Emperor stared coldly at Ji Tianqing, and his lips curled into a meaningful smile. What kind of supreme divine weapon, elixir, or medicine could have such an effect? My guess is that only the heaven-punishing formation, which is on par with the eternal heavenly book, could have such a heaven-defying effect. Ha ha ha, you may be able to hide it from others, but you cannot hide it from me. The heaven-punishing formation must be in your hands, right? Chapter 4176. To everyone in the world. Supreme quality king-level divine artifacts, divine pills, techniques, and materials were the ultimate treasures. Many peak god kings thought so as well. But to the 5 god emperors, they were used to seeing supreme quality king-level divine artifacts a long time ago. The eternal heavenly scripture and the heaven-punishing formation were divine artifacts that clearly surpassed the god-king level and could communicate with and control the power of the heavenly Tao. They were the ultimate treasures they dreamed of. Of course, besides these 2 divine artifacts of unknown origin, there was also the grey mist in the depths of the void, which was fatally attractive to them. At present, the 5 god emperors were most concerned about these 3 things. Apart from these, dynasties, billions of resources, and riches were all just floating clouds. Because at the 5 god emperors' level of strength, they pursued different things. They had long since surpassed the gods and reigned above all living beings. What they pursued was not wealth, power, fame, or status. They wanted to live as long as the heavens, coexist with the heavenly Tao, and even control it. They wanted eternal life, to control the power of the heavenly Tao, to rule the universe and become the most supreme being. The eternal heavenly scripture could only help them surpass the God-King level and take that final step into the so-called God-Emperor level. It was like a key that helped them open the door to the heavenly Tao, allowing them to step into a new realm and use and control a sliver of the power of the heavenly Tao. But it was very difficult for them to take the next step and become immortal and live as long as the heavens. As for controlling the heavenly Tao, that was even more difficult. Thus, the 5 god emperors had long ago come to a conclusion. To achieve these goals, they had to find the heaven-punishing formation. Either the heaven-punishing formation could help them achieve their goals, or the heaven-punishing formation and the eternal heavenly scripture could work together. In short, they had to find the heaven-punishing formation, but the 5 god emperors had done everything they could to search the god world and the various star zones, but to no avail. The god of the underworld had even gone to great lengths to support the heaven-punishing race in the lower world and help him search for the heaven-punishing formation. In the end, the 5 god emperors had failed to obtain the heaven-punishing formation. This was because the heaven-punishment formation had always been in Ji Tianxing's hands. Hearing Shura god emperor's words, Ji Tianxing used the same trick he used against the god of the underworld in the past. His face was full of astonishment, and he asked doubtfully, "Shura, what did you say?" "The heaven-punishing formation. Isn't it in your hands? You 5 bastards killed me back then, stole the heaven-vanquishing formation, and used the eternal heavenly scripture to break through to the God-Emperor realm. Am I wrong?" Ji Tianxing's performance was very realistic. He expressed his astonishment, shock, ecstasy, and relief very subtly. The Azura God-Emperor was also stunned for a moment, and he regretted saying the wrong thing. However, his willpower was unyielding, and he quickly regained his composure. He stared at Ji Tianxing and sneered, "Long Tian, stop acting in front of this emperor. You might be able to fool the netherworld with this little trick, but you can't fool this emperor." Clearly, the god of the underworld's clone had a similar conversation with Ji Tianxing. The god of the underworld had also mentioned this to the other god emperors. The god of the underworld had told the other 4 that he had tested the waters and was basically sure that the heaven punishment formation was not in Kenshin's hands. However, the Azura god emperor did not agree, and he still suspected that the heaven punishment formation was in Kenshin's hands. However, he did not have any conclusive evidence, so he could only suspect. And now, he was testing him in person. Unfortunately, Ji Tianxing was already prepared, and he did not reveal any flaws. The Azura god emperor stared at him and continued to ask, "When you first appeared in the god realm, your identity was first exposed, and it was only a few decades ago. Coincidentally, you were on the boundless heaven continent at that time, and you had just recovered to the divine king realm. In just a few short decades, not only have you recovered to the peak of the divine king realm, but you are also 8 times stronger than before. Tell me, other than the eternal heavenly book and the heaven punishment formation, what other treasure could have such heaven-defying effects? If the eternal heavenly book was in the hands of the 5 god emperors, then there could only be one answer. Ji Tianxing had relied on the heaven punishment formation to create such a miracle. Therefore, the Azura god emperor did not doubt it. Although this was one of the truths, Ji Tianxing would never admit it. Otherwise, he could not be sure whether the 5 god emperors would temporarily give up on the mystery of the grey fog and join forces to attack him for the sake of the heaven punishment formation. Given his current strength, if he were to be attacked by the 5 god emperors again, he would undoubtedly die. Ha ha ha. Azura, I thought you had taken the heaven punishment formation. Now it seems that you only have the eternal heavenly book. The heavens are indeed fair, and have favored me by not letting you bastards have the formation." The Azura god emperor frowned and laughed contemptuously. "Enough. Long Tian, do you take me for a fool? Do you still want to keep up the act?" Ji Tianxing laughed coldly as well. "If you think the heaven punishment formation is in my hands, then what are you waiting for? Why don't you risk your life to take it? Ha ha ha. If I have the heaven punishment formation, I will soon break through to the God Emperor realm, and even surpass you. When that happens, it will be your time to die. Azura, tell the other 4 bastards to wash their necks and wait for death." Before this, the Azura God Emperor had still firmly believed that the heaven punishment formation was in his hands. However, after hearing what he said, Emperor God Xiao Luo hesitated. He frowned and stared at Ji Tianxing, carefully observing Ji Tianxing's eyes and subtle reactions to see if he was lying. Could it be that the heaven punishment formation is really not in your hands? Then where would it be hidden? You were clearly killed by us, so how could you come back from the dead and gain such strength in just a short 100 years? Ji Tianxing pointed at the endless void above his head and said with a playful smile, as the saying goes, the worthy are blessed by the heavens. You are evil spirits who commit all kinds of evil, and the heavens will not tolerate you. But I am the embodiment of justice and light, the representative of the heavens, so the heavens especially favor me. If the heavens don't want me to die, how could I die? Also, only I can swear an oath to the heavens, and use it to restrain the powerhouses. You 5 bastards, which one of you can swear an oath on behalf of the heavens? This. The Azura God Emperor hesitated even more, and his face became very ugly. His eyes darted back and forth, and hundreds of thoughts flashed through his mind. He had to admit that Ji Tianxing was favored by the heavens, and it was very likely that he was the favored child of the heavens. It sounded very reasonable. Otherwise, how could he come back from the dead? How could he explain that he could swear an oath to the heavens to restrain the powerhouses of the immortal kings? After all, the Azura God Emperor had long heard that all the domain lords and ancient clan leaders who surrendered and pledged their loyalty to the Kenshin had to swear an oath of surrender. The key was that those long oaths were indeed witnessed and bound by the heavens. The Azura God Emperor had also asked the imperial tutor to collect a few oaths of surrender and personally read the contents of the oaths. That's right, it was an oath to the heavens. Now that he heard Ji Tianxing admit it to his face, the Azura God Emperor's mood became even more complicated. Rather than believe that Ji Tianxing had the heaven punishment formation in his hands, he felt that the seemingly absurd reason of Kenshin is the embodiment of the heavens was more believable. Book Guest House Reading Website. Chapter 4177. The subtle changes in the Azura God Emperor's expression and eyes did not escape Ji Tianxing's notice. He chuckled inwardly as he guessed that the Azura God Emperor had been led to believe the second answer. This way, the suspicion of him possessing the heaven-vanquishing array was lessened. As long as the Azura God Emperor did not have concrete evidence, he could not have incited the other God Emperors to gang up on him and steal the heaven-vanquishing array. While Emperor God Xiao Luo was distracted, Ji Tianxing adjusted his aura and divine power to suppress the injuries in his internal organs. Then, he launched another attack. Heavenly Dragon Slash. Ji Tianxing swung the Sword of Burial of Heaven with his right hand and unleashed a massive dragon-shaped sword that descended from the sky toward the Azura God Emperor. His left hand swung the hammer and unleashed a barrage of lightning that enveloped the Azura God Emperor for 100 miles before crashing down. The Azura God Emperor immediately regained his composure. Crimson flames erupted from his body as he waved his 2 fang-like black blades and unleashed a barrage of crimson light. The crimson blades were imbued with boundless killing intent. Not only did they contain the divine power of the 300 laws, but they also contained a wisp of the heavenly Tao. Any other peak god king would have been suppressed by the heavenly Tao and their strength and reflexes would have decreased. But Ji Tianxing was not affected at all. The heavenly Tao's divine power had no effect on him. This was something he had already verified when he fought with the other God Emperor's avatars. Bam bam bam! The divine techniques unleashed by the two clashed fiercely in the void, creating earth-shattering explosions that reverberated through the void. Divine light splashed in all directions as the sword and saber images collapsed. The two were also knocked back 30,000 feet by the powerful recoil. The two unleashed their divine power and clashed 3 more times. Ji Tianxing was finally certain that the avatar of the Azura God Emperor was not as strong as before. It was not that the Azura God Emperor was deliberately hiding his divine power, but that he had expended too much of his energy and his battle prowess was truly declining. With that, Ji Tianxing was relieved. He let out a low roar, and his entire body radiated with dazzling golden light as he used the dragon race's ultimate technique. Celestial Dragon Tyrant Body. In the next moment, he expanded more than 1,000 times in the dazzling golden light, turning into a giant golden-armored god that was 10,000 feet tall. His entire body was covered in golden dragon scales, which protected him like a suit of armor. Dragon horns also grew out of his forehead, holy and sharp. His battle prowess also soared, explosively increasing by 8 times. Before this, his strength was slightly lacking compared to the Shura God Emperor's avatar. He had to rely on his perfect sword skills and battle experience to fight the Shura God Emperor to a draw. But now, he was far more powerful than the Shura God Emperor. He had an overwhelming advantage. Most importantly, even if he exhausted all of his divine power in the battle, he could still find a way to escape and replenish his power. As for the Shura God Emperor's avatar, once it ran out of energy, it would be on the verge of collapse. Seeing Ji Tianxing transform into a 10,000-foot-tall giant and increase his battle prowess by 8 times, the Shura God Emperor's eyes widened in anger and shock. Damned bastard, you're still hiding your strength. You still have a trump card. In all fairness, Ji Tianxing's battle prowess was already shocking enough. The Shura God Emperor could not believe that a peak divine king could be so powerful. But now, Ji Tianxing's battle prowess had increased by 8 times. Even the Shura God Emperor could guess that this kind of divine power that could temporarily increase one's battle prowess would not last long. Perhaps it would even have serious side effects. But the fact that Ji Tianxing could wait until now to use this move was beyond his expectations. After all, Ji Tianxing's battle prowess had already surpassed his avatar's. In other words, Ji Tianxing could already erupt with 60 to 70% of his original strength. A peak divine king could actually erupt with 60 to 70% of a God Emperor's strength. How frightening was this? The Shura God Emperor's heart was filled with worry. He had to consider a question. Given Long Tian's astonishing rate of growth, wouldn't he be able to break through to the God Emperor realm in a few more decades? The 5 God Emperors were well aware that the God Emperor realm was not something that could be broken through by relying on talent and opportunity. There were already 5 God Emperors in this world, and it was basically impossible for a 6th God Emperor to appear. If a 6th God Emperor were to appear in the future, it would definitely be Long Tian. After all, Long Tian's talent and comprehension were superb, and he was also a lucky fellow blessed by the heavens. The God Emperor realm required one to comprehend and control the power of the heavenly Tao. For a lucky fellow like Long Tian, it was the same as cheating. No. After today, this God Emperor must convince the other 4 to get rid of Long Tian no matter what. As long as this calamity is not eliminated, we will not be able to rest in peace. This thought flashed through the Shura God Emperor's mind, and he resolved to get rid of Ji Tianxing as soon as possible. At this time, Ji Tianxing once again brandished the Burial of Heaven and the Divine Hammer, launching a ferocious attack. Sword Rain. Heaven-splitting sword. The Burial of Heaven pointed the sword into the depths of the void, and 90,000 stars lit up in the firmament and fell like a meteor shower. This sword divine ability was very powerful, but there was a slight delay after it was released. To deal with an expert like the Shura God Emperor, it could only be used when he was unprepared. If the Shura God Emperor was prepared, he would have teleported tens of thousands of kilometers away before the sword rain fell. As for the other move, Heaven-splitting sword, it was not executed with the Burial of Heaven, but with the Divine Hammer. At Ji Tianxing's level, no matter what kind of weapon he used, it would not affect his ability to use divine techniques. Not to mention the Divine Hammer, even if he was barehanded, he could still use this sword divine ability. A moment later, the Shura God Emperor, who was filled with worry and anxiety, finally came to his senses. He felt the invisible sword intent of the heavens envelop him, as if the heavens were angry and the heavenly Tao was punishing him. He immediately realized that something was wrong. He did not even look up at the sky, but teleported backward and retreated. Apart from Ji Tianxing, no other God King could teleport through the void, because they did not have the power of space to use and control it. But a God Emperor could do it. After all, a God Emperor could borrow the power of the heavenly Tao. As for why Ji Tianxing could teleport through the void, it was probably because of this. It was just that he could not sense the power of the heavenly Tao, so he could not comprehend it or use it. He could not even obtain the heavenly Tao merit. Whoosh! In the blink of an eye, the Shura God Emperor had teleported 30,000 kilometers away. Originally, he had already escaped the range of the sword rain. But the 90,000 stellar swords had long since locked onto his aura. No matter where he fled, they would follow him. Thus, the 90,000 stellar swords turned around and charged at the Shura God Emperor. Whoosh whoosh whoosh. The sword light whistled past with incredible speed, catching up to the Shura God Emperor in the blink of an eye and drowning him. Bam bam bam. Then, the tens of thousands of stellar swords slammed into the Shura God Emperor, creating a series of dull booms. Chapter 4178. Following a series of muffled sounds, countless fragments of starlight scattered across the void. The Azura God Emperor knew that he couldn't escape the sword rain, so he used all his strength to form a blood flame shield to protect himself. The 6 broad blood-red wings on his back also wrapped around his body tightly. At the same time, he released a surge of divine energy, forming thousands of blood-red blades that circled around his body to form a defensive barrier. With these 3 layers of protection, he was confident that he could withstand the sword rain. Bang 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 bang. Tens of thousands of stellar swords struck the Azura God Emperor one after another, but they were all blocked by the blood-red blade's barrier. The blood-red blade barrier shook violently under the onslaught of the stellar swords, and cracks began to appear on its surface. However, the stellar swords were also shattered, scattering countless fragments of starlight. A total of 15,000 stellar swords were shattered by the blade barrier and dissipated into the void. However, the sharp blade barrier was also completely destroyed and disintegrated on the spot. The Azura God Emperor's first line of defense was destroyed by the stellar swords. In the next moment, tens of thousands of stellar swords struck the Azura God Emperor's blood-red shield one after another. This oval-shaped blood-red shield was 10,000 feet tall and 3 inches thick. A thick blood-red color swirled around it, and flames soared into the sky. Bang bang bang. Muffled sounds rang out one after another, interspersed with catcher-catcher sounds. That was the sound of the starry greatsword being shattered after hitting the bloodlight shield with all its might. Of course, there were also sounds of cracks appearing on the blood-red shield. This time, 25,000 starry swords were consumed before the bloody shield was broken and disintegrated. The Azura God Emperor's second line of defense was also destroyed by the stellar swords. At this point, the Azura God Emperor only had one last line of defense left, and that was his 6 Azura wings that wrapped around his body. Of the 90,000 stellar swords, 40,000 had been used. Only 50,000 remained. The Shura God Emperor's heart was filled with anger and shock. He didn't expect Ji Tianxing's sword arts to be so complex and powerful. Those tens of thousands of starry swords seemed to have intelligence and intelligence. After the first 40,000 great star swords dissipated, the remaining 50,000 great star swords formed a sword formation and attacked him one after another. Swish, swish. The starry swords flew back and forth in the void, interweaving into a sword formation that had a radius of 1,000 miles. They kept a special rhythm and frequency, attacking continuously. Peng peng peng. The great star sword slammed into the Azura God Emperor's blood-colored wings, creating a series of muffled sounds that reverberated endlessly in the void. The Azura God Emperor's body trembled from the bombardment, and his blood-red wings flashed with a dark red light. Even though the Azura God Emperor did his best to circulate his divine energy, flapping his wings to launch a counterattack, he managed to shatter many of the stellar swords. However, 2 of his wings were injured and had been pierced through earlier. Now, under the onslaught of the great star swords, those 2 wings were quickly cut into pieces. The heart-wrenching pain caused the Azura God Emperor to fly into a rage, his eyes filled with blood-red flames. Bastard! Long Tian, this emperor will tear you to pieces. The Azura God Emperor swung his blood-red blades with all his might, blocking the incoming great star swords from all directions. However, there were too many of them. Even though he could destroy dozens of great star swords in a breath's time, he was still hit by more. After 10 breaths, all 50,000 great star swords collapsed, dissipated, or ran out of energy. The dazzling net of great star swords disappeared, and the Azura God Emperor finally breathed a sigh of relief. However, his injuries were even more severe, and he looked even more battered. In addition to the 2 destroyed wings, 2 more had been pierced through, leaving behind several bloody wounds. His chest and back also had several new wounds, from which purple blood continuously flowed out. He panted heavily, circulating his energy to suppress his injuries, but his combat strength was also declining. Ji Tianxing, on the other hand, was unscathed. His golden body showed no signs of injury, and his strength was also at its peak. The Azura God Emperor stared coldly at him, thinking to himself, even if you use a forbidden secret technique to increase your combat strength by 8 times, it's destined that you won't be able to maintain it for long. As long as this emperor can hold on for another 15 minutes, your combat strength will decline and you will suffer a backlash from the secret technique, and your time of death will come. Just as this thought flashed through his mind, Ji Tianqing launched another attack. Starry River Break. Ji Tianqing first swung his divine hammer, slashing out a great star sword over 10,000 feet long, slashing towards the Azura God Emperor's head. This great star sword was formed by the convergence of the endless power of the stars. There were hundreds of millions of stars in the void, which could provide endless power of the stars. In addition, the 90,000 great star swords had just dissipated, and the surrounding void was filled with a rich amount of star power. Therefore, this divine power, Starry River Break, was the most suitable one. Seeing the great star sword slashing down, the Azura God Emperor remained calm. He waved the nameless blade with both hands, sending out crimson blade auras. Bang bang bang! Ka. Dozens of crimson blade auras clashed with the great star sword, creating a series of muffled booms and shattering sounds. In the blink of an eye, the great star sword was pulverized, and the dozens of crimson blade auras were also disintegrated. The Azura God Emperor had just neutralized Ji Tianqing's attack when another great star sword came crashing down with terrifying divine power. Sword of World Annihilation. Without a doubt, this was a secret technique that Ji Tianqing had used after absorbing a vast amount of 5 elemental world energy. This sword was filled with an indomitable, unstoppable, and unstoppable aura, and it really did have the power to destroy the world. As the great star sword came crashing down, even the pitch-black void started to ripple, creating layers of ripples. The Azura God Emperor's aura was locked onto by the great star sword, and he found it difficult to breathe and even felt a trace of fear in his heart. This is the power of the world. He sensed that the great star sword's aura was special, and only after carefully sensing it did he realize what it was. His face immediately turned ugly. Despicable guy, he hasn't even broken through to the God Emperor stage, but he has already mastered a special power that is not inferior to the power of the heavenly Tao. Even the 5 of us can't refine the divine realm or use the power of the world. How did he do it? To be honest, the Azura God Emperor was already feeling a little jealous of Ji Tianqing. Although he didn't know how many miraculous encounters Ji Tianqing had, or how many opportunities and treasures he had obtained, he knew that Ji Tianqing was one of them. This guy must be the chosen one, the lucky one blessed by the heavens. Otherwise, how could a person be so lucky? As these thoughts flashed through his mind, the Azura God Emperor had no choice but to teleport away to avoid the Sword of World Annihilation. However, he was locked onto by the Sword of World Annihilation, and his strength was suppressed, so he couldn't escape fast enough. He had just teleported 20,000 kilometers away when the Sword of World Annihilation caught up to him and struck him. Chapter 4179. Kaboom! The 10,000 Zhong long world exterminating sword hit Emperor God Xiao Luo and there was a loud bang. Fortunately, he knew that he couldn't dodge this attack, so he formed a divine power shield in time and raised the 2 blades above his head. The World Destroyer sword slashed down and struck the 2 top-grade king-level nameless blades first. With 2 loud bangs, the 2 blades buzzed violently and were sent flying, falling into the void 100 miles away. Then, the power of World Destroyer sword didn't decrease and it hit Emperor God Xiao Luo's divine power shield. With a loud cracking sound, the blood-red shield was smashed into pieces on the spot, and countless blood-red fragments splashed out. The Azura God Emperor let out a painful groan as he was sent flying hundreds of miles away. While he was still flying, a long trail of purple blood spilled behind him. When he fell into the void 100 miles away, he could clearly see that his left shoulder had almost been cut off. There was a huge wound that split his left shoulder bone in half, leaving only a few thin bones and a few tendons connected to his arm and shoulder. Neatly broken bones could be seen in the hideous wound, and blood gushed out like a fountain. This was the worst injury the Azura God Emperor had suffered since the start of their battle. The pain in his body was nothing, but the deep sense of humiliation and defeat made his body tremble in anger. His entire body was surrounded by bloody flames that soared into the sky. But he didn't roar or shout, and he didn't say anything. Because he knew very well that he couldn't beat Ji Tianqing, so no matter what he said, he would only be humiliating himself. A moment later, he suppressed his anger and calmed himself down. A thought flashed through his mind, and he changed his attitude. This is the first time he has used this divine ability since I started fighting with him. From the looks of it, this divine ability should be his trump card, his ultimate secret technique. He used a forbidden technique to increase his combat strength by 8 times in a short time, but it will be over soon. That's why he was so anxious and didn't hold anything back. He just wanted to end the battle as soon as possible. If that's the case, I just need to buy some time until his forbidden technique is over. Tempage, when his strength declines and he suffers a backlash, won't he be at my mercy? With this thought, the Azura God Emperor was no longer anxious or angry. He reached out and picked up the 2 blades that fell hundreds of miles away, and hurriedly circulated his energy to suppress his injuries. Ji Tianxing wasn't in a hurry to attack, and he wasn't in a hurry either. He was happy to buy time. But unfortunately, Ji Tianxing only paused for 2 breaths of time before attacking again. Emperor God Xiao Luo changed his mind and decided to avoid fighting with Ji Tianxing head-on. Instead, he tried to stall him. He wanted to wait until Ji Tianxing's strength declined and counterattack. This move was indeed effective. Although the Azura God Emperor couldn't avoid all of Ji Tianxing's attacks, he did slow down Ji Tianxing's attack frequency and delay Ji Tianxing's rhythm. Time slowly passed. Before he knew it, 15 minutes had passed. In this 15 minutes, Ji Tianxing attacked over 1,000 times, using countless divine powers and consummate skills. The Azura God Emperor only dodged, circled, and fought, refusing to face Ji Tianxing head-on. Even when Ji Tianxing mocked and taunted him, he turned a deaf ear and suppressed his anger. After 15 minutes of fighting, Ji Tianxing's condition didn't change much. But the Azura God Emperor's injuries were even worse. There were over 100 wounds all over his body, all of them dyed purple with blood. His strength was also steadily declining, and he was getting weaker and weaker. After a quarter of an hour had passed, he became suspicious and vigilant. He was a little anxious. What puzzled him was that he estimated that Ji Tianxing's transformation state would last 15 minutes at most, and his strength would begin to decline. But Ji Tianxing was still calm and composed, showing no signs of weakening, not to mention the backlash from the secret technique. What made him even more wary was that Ji Tianxing's strength didn't decline, but he only had 60% of his strength left. He didn't dare to delay any longer. Once his strength fell to 30%, it would be very difficult to escape Ji Tianxing's pursuit. And once his strength was exhausted, this incarnation would also be destroyed. Damn it, what kind of secret technique did he use to last so long? The Azura God Emperor stared at Ji Tianxing, wishing he could see through him. He was a knowledgeable person, but he had never seen a secret technique that could increase one's combat strength by 8 times and maintain it for so long. This was too heaven-defying. No, I can't be sure when his strength will decline. I can't just keep dodging and fighting, I have to counterattack to last longer. The Azura God Emperor changed his mind again. Seeing Ji Tianxing charging at him, he began to counterattack. The 2 of them began to fight fiercely in the void, their figures flashing and shuttling in the darkness. In the dark void, a deafening explosion erupted, and a dazzling divine light flashed. The area around the 2 of them was illuminated by the divine light, dazzling everything within tens of thousands of miles. Just like that, another 30 minutes passed. The Azura God Emperor's injuries were getting worse and worse. All 6 of his wings had been pierced, and many holes had been torn open. There was almost no place on his body that was intact. There were at least 100 wounds, so deep that bones were exposed, and blood was constantly flowing out. With such serious injuries, his strength had fallen to about 50%, and he was clearly feeling very weak. At this time, Ji Tianxing's dragon transformation state was still not over. Even though he had used up a lot of energy, and his fighting strength had decreased slightly. Compared to the Azura God Emperor, he was still full of energy and calm. The Azura God Emperor couldn't understand at all. He was angry, shocked, and jealous. It was already a miracle that a secret skill that could increase one's fighting strength by 8 times could last for 15 minutes. However, Ji Tianxing had lasted for 45 minutes, and there was no sign of him fading. This was absolutely unprecedented. If it were any other expert who could master such a divine ability, they would be able to challenge and kill enemies above their level. This was too heaven-defying. The Azura God Emperor was very jealous. He couldn't help but think that if he could master this secret skill, not only would he be able to easily kill Long Tien, the other 4 God Emperor wouldn't be his match. At that time, he would definitely find the right time to eliminate the 4 of them one by one, and monopolize the grey fog and the myriad world. No, I can't drag this out any longer. Once my strength falls below 50%, it will be very dangerous. The only thing I can do now is to retreat. Emperor God Xiao Luo had such a thought. He felt his face burning and he felt extremely ashamed. Before this, he had never thought that as the Supreme God Emperor, there would be a day when he was forced to run away from an enemy. This was too shameful, too humiliating. Chapter 4180. The Azura God Emperor had already made up his mind to escape. As for the Azura Divine Palace, the Imperial Tutor, and the thousands of soldiers, he could no longer care about them. At worst, the Rebel Alliance would win, and the entire boundless heaven continent would be occupied by Ji Tianxing. And he would bear the humiliation of not being able to defeat Kenshin and running away and become the laughingstock of the boundless heaven continent, and even the entire God realm. Shame, it was indeed very shameful. But this incarnation could be preserved and would not be destroyed on the spot by Ji Tianxing. Even if the boundless heaven continent was occupied by Ji Tianxing, it was only temporary. After he dealt with the grey fog mystery, his original body could kill his way back to the God realm at any time and take back the boundless heaven continent. But today, he fought Ji Tianxing to the end, and most likely he would collapse here. The fact that the boundless heaven continent was occupied and he became the laughingstock of the God realm would not change at all. In contrast, he would lose an incarnation, and more than 100 years of hard work would go up in smoke. Even though the Azura God Emperor had already made up his mind. But he did not reveal any clues on the surface to avoid being detected and seen through by Ji Tianxing. After he exchanged 2 more moves with Ji Tianxing, he took advantage of the moment when he was forced back by Ji Tianxing's sword and decisively teleported 30,000 miles away, fleeing into the depths of the void. Whoosh! With a flash of light, the Azura God Emperor left the battle circle and appeared 30,000 miles away, flying away without looking back. His figure flickered repeatedly in the void, crossing 20,000 miles every time he flickered. His speed was extremely fast. Seeing this scene, Ji Tianxing was also stunned for a moment, and a trace of astonishment flashed in his eyes. Although he also guessed that the Azura God Emperor's strength was not enough, he would definitely not sit still and wait for death and would most likely escape. But he did not expect the Azura God Emperor to be so cautious and flee so decisively. He thought that the Azura God Emperor would flee when he was even weaker, when he only had 40% or 30% of his strength left. Who would have thought that the Azura God Emperor would flee when he only had 50% of his strength left? TSK. You gave up on the Imperial Tutor and his soldiers so easily and turned around to escape without any hesitation. Do you not care about your reputation at all? Aren't you afraid of being ridiculed by the world and becoming the laughingstock of the God realm? Ji Tianxing chased after the Azura God Emperor with the Burial of Heaven sword and godly hammer in hand. The Azura God Emperor was 50,000 kilometers ahead of him. However, he was stronger and in a better state. His speed was also faster. The 2 of them were like 2 resplendent specks of light. One was blood red, the other dark gold. They chased and leaped about in the void. In just 10 breaths of time, the distance between the 2 of them had shrunk to about 10,000 miles. To the 2 of them, a distance of 10,000 miles was already very close. They could exchange blows and kill each other. Ji Tianxing decisively swung his godly hammer and sword of Burial of Heaven and launched a fierce attack on the Azura God Emperor. The Azura God Emperor did not want to fight him head-on. He did not want to be entangled with him and lose the opportunity to escape. Thus, he only cast spells to block Ji Tianxing's attacks and minimize the damage to himself. Most of his strength was still used to escape. Bam bam bam! After a series of dull thuds, the Azura God Emperor's body flashed with divine light and blood splattered everywhere. His divine power shield had been broken, and his injuries had worsened. His strength was also gradually weakening. However, at the cost of his injuries, he successfully evaded Ji Tianxing's attacks and continued to flee into the depths of the void. As he fled, Ji Tianxing continued to taunt and provoke the Azura God Emperor. He hoped to provoke him and make him stop and fight to the end. However, the Azura God Emperor saw through his intentions. No matter how much he taunted, the Azura God Emperor turned a deaf ear and continued to flee. At the same time, the Azura God Emperor was secretly calculating the time, praying that Ji Tianxing's transformation would end as soon as possible. If Ji Tianxing returned to normal and suffered a backlash from the secret technique, his strength would decline, and he would be in an extremely weak state. The Azura God Emperor would stop running and turn around to kill Ji Tianxing. He had been waiting for this opportunity. However, the duration of Ji Tianxing's transformation had far exceeded his expectations. He could not tell when Ji Tianxing would return to normal. He also could not guarantee that when Ji Tianxing returned to normal, he would be seriously injured and whether he would still have the strength to kill Ji Tianxing. As time passed, Ji Tianxing and the Azura God Emperor continued to fly through the void, getting further and further away from the God realm. After another quarter of an hour, the two had traveled 3 million li in the void. At this point, Ji Tianxing's celestial dragon tyrant body finally ended. His body shrunk back to its normal size, and his super strong combat strength also returned to normal. The Azura God Emperor, who was flying in front, saw that Ji Tianxing had finally returned to normal and heaved a sigh of relief. The pressure on him was greatly reduced. Phew! That damned guy, he actually maintained it for an hour before it ended. Such a powerful secret technique is rare in the world, one of a kind. Once I kill him, I will refine his soul and memories and take this secret technique for myself. With this in mind, the Azura God Emperor continued to maintain his speed while observing Ji Tianxing's reaction. He was looking forward to seeing how pitiful Ji Tianxing would be when the secret technique backfired on him and his strength rapidly weakened, or even when he was heavily injured. At that time, he would have the chance to take revenge and kill Ji Tianxing as he wished. However, Emperor God Xiao Luo thought again and felt that something was amiss. Long Tian should be very clear that this kind of secret technique that increases one's combat strength for a short period of time will definitely have serious repercussions. Now that the secret technique has ended, if he does not want to be killed by me when the secret technique backfires, he should have given up on chasing me and turned to run. But he does not seem to have any intention of running away, he is still chasing after me. Thinking of this, the Azura God Emperor felt a sense of unease and fear. Could it be that after using this secret technique, he will not suffer a backlash? That's impossible. All secret techniques that can temporarily increase one's combat strength will overdraft one's strength and potential, resulting in serious consequences. This is in line with the principles of the heavenly Tao. The Azura God Emperor could not believe that Ji Tianxing was safe and sound. But on second thought, this guy was the heaven's chosen child who was blessed by the heavens. What heavenly Tao's rule, heaven's chosen child should not be affected by it, right? Thinking of this, the Azura God Emperor's face changed, and his eyes flashed with anxiety and anger. Damn it, this emperor couldn't have guessed correctly, right? He sped up and fled into the depths of the void while paying close attention to Ji Tianxing's situation. In the end, Ji Tianxing chased him for another 1,000,000 miles and injured him 3 times, but there was still no sign of the secret technique backfiring on him. This confirmed the Azura God Emperor's conjecture, and at the same time, he felt a deep sense of anger, jealousy, and despair. A secret technique that can increase one's combat strength by 8 times and last for an hour without any repercussions. How can such a heaven-defying secret technique exist in this world and be obtained by Long Tian? The heavens are so unfair. Chapter 4181. To say that the heavens were too unfair to a lucky person who had been blessed by the heavens was somewhat helpless. The Azura God Emperor was indeed at his wits' end against Ji Tianxing. Even after Ji Tianxing's transformation had ended and he had returned to his normal state, he was still full of energy and divine power, not at all weakened or fatigued. Compared to Emperor God Xiao Luo, who was severely injured, his power was still very strong. Helpless, the Azura God Emperor could only continue to flee. His hope of killing Ji Tianxing had been dashed, and he no longer dared to hope for anything more. He would be satisfied if he could escape safely. However, such a small wish was very difficult to realize. The two chased each other through the void for another hour. Ji Tianxing was in a constant state of pursuit, catching up to the Azura God Emperor every once in a while and using his ultimate skills to beat him into a corner, worsening his injuries. On the other hand, the Azura God Emperor was in a constant state of flight, constantly being attacked by Ji Tianxing's various divine abilities and secret arts. He was exhausted from parrying and dodging. If he had stopped and resisted with all his might, he would not have been so badly injured. But even if he had stopped to fight Ji Tianxing, he was still no match for Ji Tianxing, and there was no way he could have turned the tables. In the end, he would have run out of energy and died in the void. Therefore, he was also very helpless to fall into such a passive and embarrassing situation. He had no way to turn the situation around. As long as no miracle occurred, and no other God Emperor's avatar came to the Azura God Emperor's aid, the result of this battle was actually already decided. Even if he gritted his teeth and endured for 4 hours, running for 30 million li, it was useless. In the end, Emperor God Xiao Luo's embodiment was destroyed by Ji Tianxing in the void after it was severely injured and its power was exhausted. Then, it dissipated. Unfortunately, this was only an avatar. After being killed by Ji Tianxing, it did not leave behind any precious treasures. There were only 2 top-grade king-grade fangs, a spatial ring, and a tattered set of armor. Moreover, the 2 fangs had been cracked and chipped by Ji Tianxing in the previous battle. Fortunately, the fangs and armor were both top-grade king-grade divine artifacts. Even if they could not be used anymore, the materials were still very precious. After picking up the 3 spoils, Ji Tianxing threw the 2 fangs and the armor to the heaven-mending orb to devour. Only the spatial ring was left, and he kept it. After the battle ended, the void regained its tranquility and became pitch black again. Ji Tianxing turned around and flew towards the divine world, flying towards the gap in the Azura paradise. After flying at full speed for 3 hours, he returned to the gap in the Azura paradise. At this time, the Azura paradise had been completely destroyed. It was on the verge of collapse and disintegration. Even the power of the heavens would not be able to repair the huge cracks and holes in the void. Ji Tianxing passed through the huge crack in the void and returned to the shattered Azura paradise. As far as the eye could see, the scene in the grotto heaven had undergone a drastic change compared to a few hours ago. The green mountains, the endless forests, and the mountains had all disappeared under the ravages of the void storm. Everything within a few 100,000 miles had been eroded and occupied by the void, turning it into an endless darkness. Ji Tianxing passed through the dark void and returned to the depths of the paradise, where the Azura Divine Palace was located. He saw that the battle had already ended. The magnificent and majestic Azura Divine Palace's defensive array had long been breached. Under the attacks of countless powerhouses, it had been reduced to ruins. The remnants of the broken bricks and broken walls, as well as the rising flames and black smoke, were still telling the story of the tragic battle. The shattered defensive array only had a few foundations buried in the ruins. The dark red walls of light still flickered with a faint blood-red light. Fragments of weapons and armors could be seen everywhere in the ruins, as well as some corpses of divine monarchs. The thousands of soldiers under the imperial tutor's command had disappeared. The 10,000 soldiers of the Rebel Alliance and the 20 divine warships had also disappeared. Ji Tianxing carefully observed again, and discovered that this battlefield had also been simply cleaned up. At the very least, the spatial rings and other spoils of war of the imperial tutor's soldiers had been collected. The corpses of the dead soldiers of the Rebel Alliance had also been collected. It has been almost 10 hours since I left the Azura paradise to pursue the Azura God Emperor. The battle here should have ended 4 hours ago. Yarrow Yarrow, Cuckoo, and the others must have led the soldiers out of the Azura paradise to recuperate outside. Previously, Ji Tianxing had left the Azura paradise alone to deal with the Azura God Emperor. Yun Yarrow, Ji Ku, and the others had stayed behind to help the Rebel Alliance's army. Even if Ji Tianxing was not present, Nangong Buhua, as the deputy alliance leader, would make the right choice in time and give the appropriate orders. In addition, if Nangong Buhua could not make up his mind, he would definitely ask for Yun Yarrow and Ji Ku's opinion. Ji Tianxing was not worried about this at all. Therefore, he looked up at the collapsed Azura paradise and the ruins that were quickly being swallowed by the void storm. Then, he turned and flew out. He was certain that the Azura paradise could not be saved. After today, it would disappear and be removed from the boundless heaven continent. The Azura God Emperor's avatar had also been destroyed. The Azura God Emperor would not be able to do anything in the short term. In other words, the Rebel Alliance had won a complete victory. The boundless heaven continent was under Ji Tianqing's rule. This situation would not change for the next few decades. The situation was just as Ji Tianqing had predicted. When he left the Azura paradise, he saw 21 divine warships floating in the vast sea of clouds outside. Those divine warships maintained their formation, lined up neatly, and waited quietly. The disciples of the various clans and sects had returned to their respective divine warships. They were probably recuperating and healing. Those 20 divine warships were covered in scars. They kept flickering with divine light, and their power was somewhat unstable. Each clan had sent out a few God King experts to cast spells to deal with the scars and gaps on the divine warships. As for the God-slaying warship in the lead, it was naturally intact. There were only a few scars and scratches on it. Ji Tianqing returned to the God-slaying warship and spread out his divine sense. He was clear of everyone's movements. The white dragon was in the control room. He was busy studying various array formations and repairing some of the scars on the divine warship. Yun Yarrow, Ji Ku, and the others had returned to the distorted spacetime of the Nine Heavens 10 Absolutes pagoda to heal their injuries. Ji Tianqing entered the distorted spacetime to check on everyone's situation. He was truly relieved when he saw that although everyone's injuries were not light, their lives were not in danger. Chapter 4182. The meeting room was extremely spacious. The 20 clan leaders and sect leaders only took 100 breaths to gather here. Everyone's gaze was focused on Ji Tianqing, who was sitting at the head of the table. They all looked excited and expectant as they waited for Ji Tianqing to announce the answer. This was because everyone was very concerned about one question. Did the Alliance leader defeat the Shura God Emperor's clone? This was an extremely important question. Everyone could not wait to know the answer. Ji Tianqing originally wanted to ask everyone about the situation in the Shura Grotto Heaven. However, when he saw how excited and expectant everyone was, he guessed what they were thinking. Before he could speak, Nangong Buhua stood up and cupped his fists. He smiled and said, "Alliance leader, the battle with the Imperial Tutor ended 4 hours ago. During these 4 hours, while everyone was recuperating, they were also very concerned about your safety. Now that you have returned safely, everyone can be at ease. However, everyone still wants to know what happened to the Shura God Emperor's clone." As soon as Nangong Buhua finished speaking, the clan leaders and sect leaders nodded and agreed. There were also 2 clan leaders who were good at flattering. They immediately took the opportunity to flatter Ji Tianqing. "Vice Alliance leader Nangong, do you still need to ask? Since the Alliance leader has returned safely, the Shura God Emperor's clone must have been defeated." "That's right. Do you know how wise and powerful the Alliance leader is? If the Shura God Emperor's original body is here, he can still fight with the Alliance leader. It's just a clone. He must have been beaten to a pulp by the Alliance leader. It's too horrible to look at." Although they were flattering, their words were not too exaggerated and did not make people feel disgusted. Instead, everyone smiled knowingly. Ji Tianqing nodded slightly. After everyone quieted down, he said, "Before returning to the divine world, I killed several God Emperor's clones in the void outside the divine world. Although the incarnation of the Azura God Emperor had been sacrificed by 99,000 people, it had gained great power. However, evil can never triumph over good. In the end, he was no match for me. I've already killed him in the void and turned him into ashes." Hearing this result, everyone present was stunned for a moment. Soon after, they revealed an expression of disbelief and cheered in surprise. "You actually killed the incarnation of the Azura God Emperor? Oh my God! Isn't Lord Alliance Chief's strength a little too powerful? We thought that you would only be able to defeat him and allow him to escape in the end. Who would have thought that he would be so powerful?" The Azura God Emperor's avatar had 50% of his original strength, but he was still killed by the Alliance Master. Doesn't this mean that Lord Alliance leader's true strength is not far from that of the Azura God Emperor? Ha ha ha. Although Lord Alliance Chief is a peak divine king, he has strength comparable to the God Emperor. Simply inconceivable. In the past 1,000 years, we have all heard of Lord Alliance Chief's various legends and miracles. Now, we have followed Lord Alliance Chief and witnessed you create another miracle with our own eyes. We have won. The boundless heaven continent is ours. That's right. We have won. We have won a complete victory. We have won beautifully. Lord Alliance Chief is so mighty. The patriarchs and sect masters who were usually high and mighty no longer cared about being reserved. They all cheered and discussed excitedly. Their faces were full of smiles, and their eyes shone brightly with excitement. After all, they had taken a great risk and followed the Rebel Alliance to fight all over the world. They had paid a great price. Now that they had finally won, their efforts were worth it. Ji Tianxing raised his hand and motioned for everyone to quiet down. He then asked, Deputy Alliance Chief Nangong, please report the results of the battle at the Azura Grotto Heaven. Nangong Buhua hurriedly stood up and bowed. With a solemn expression, he reporting to Lord Alliance Master, we didn't let you down. We successfully broke into the Azura Divine Palace and destroyed the army under the Imperial Preceptor. All the soldiers under the Imperial Tutor, regardless of whether they were God Monarchs or God Kings, were killed. No one was left alive. Even the Imperial Tutor was besieged by us. In the end, his body was smashed into pieces and he died on the spot. In this battle, the Alliance's soldiers had also paid a great price. A total of 4,000 soldiers were sacrificed. Of the 12,000 survivors, they were either lightly or heavily injured. There were also 20 divine warships that suffered varying degrees of damage. It will take a long time for them to recover. However, at such a price, we have destroyed the Azura Divine Palace and destroyed the Imperial Tutor's army. It can be considered a complete victory. Nangong Buhua paused for a moment. He, the patriarchs, and the patriarchs all wore proud looks on their faces, as well as gratified looks. Before this, the people of the boundless heaven continent only knew that the Kenshin was unparalleled and domineering. The Rebel Alliance had been invincible and had won successive battles because of the Kenshin's reputation and strength. However, in this battle, the patriarchs and sects had used facts to prove that they were not weak. They had enough strength to defeat their opponents. They had won with their own abilities. They had not let down the Kenshin's trust and high regard. Ji Tianxing revealed a satisfied smile and nodded. Everyone, you have worked hard. Well done. Today's battle was won so smoothly because of everyone's efforts. I have already said that after saving the people of the world and occupying the boundless heaven continent, everyone will be rewarded according to their performance. I will begin this matter in a moment. Hearing the words reward according to their performance, the patriarchs and sect masters' eyes lit up. They were even more eager and eager. At this time, Nangong Buhua continued to report. Reporting to Lord Alliance Leader, after the battle ended, the Alliance seized all the spoils of war and collected the remains and belongings of the soldiers. Seeing that the Azura Paradise was on the verge of collapse and was about to be swallowed by the void, we emptied the Azura Divine Palace's treasury and retreated from the Azura Paradise to wait for your return. We are still counting the spoils of war. Once we are done, I will personally present them to you. Ji Tianxing knew that the Imperial Tutor and his 10,000 soldiers were all very rich. They controlled a huge amount of resources and wealth. In particular, the Azura Divine Palace's treasury must contain inestimable resources and wealth. At the very least, there were resources worth tens of trillions of dollars. At the very least, even if there were resources worth tens of trillions of dollars, more than Ji Tianxing's entire net worth, he would not be surprised. After all, the Azura God Emperor had controlled the boundless heaven continent for more than 1,000 years and had been greedily seizing cultivation resources. Ji Tianxing nodded in agreement and said to everyone, rest and recuperate for a few days. After everything is over, I will gather everyone for a meeting. Chapter 4183. Logically speaking, after the war ended, the people of the various clans and sects would naturally return to their grotto heavens to recuperate. However, The grotto heavens of these 20 clans and sects were distributed in various regions of the boundless heaven continent and were very far away from each other. Once they were separated, it would take another month to gather again. Since that was the case, they might as well wait outside the Azura grotto heaven for a few days. After the follow-up matters were settled, it would not be too late to return to their respective grotto heavens. In any case, the boundless heaven continent had already been conquered by the rebel alliance. The 20 clans and sects had already completed their mission, so they were not in a hurry to return to recuperate. They would rather wait a few more days for Ji Tianxing to reward them according to their merits, then return home in glory. In the next few days, everyone stayed in the divine warship to recuperate. Ji Tianxing also suffered serious injuries, so he entered the distorted spacetime of the divine pagoda to recuperate in seclusion for a period of time. 4 days had passed in the outside world, and he had been recuperating in the distorted spacetime for 200 days. His injuries were basically stable, and there were no major problems. If he wanted to fully recover from his injuries, it would not be a matter of 1 or 2 years. He would have to recuperate for at least 10 years. After all, when the Azura God Emperor's incarnation fought with him, most of the injuries caused to him were Dao injuries. Compared to ordinary injuries, Dao injuries were even more difficult to recover from. Ji Tianxing ended his seclusion to recuperate and left the distorted spacetime. He walked out of the divine warship to check on the situation of the Azura grotto heaven. The result was as he expected. The Azura grotto heaven had been completely devoured by the void and no longer existed. The divine formation and spatial door in the sea of clouds had also collapsed and disintegrated. That sky was originally the entrance to the Azura grotto heaven, but now it was already empty. From now on, the Azura grotto heaven was a thing of the past and would eventually be annihilated in the long river of history. After confirming that the Azura grotto heaven no longer existed, Ji Tianxing had to consider a problem. After occupying the boundless heaven continent, he had to set up a divine palace as the highest place of governance. Even if he was not in the boundless heaven continent, Nangong Buhua had to oversee the various affairs of the continent to show his authority. The divine palace could not be built anywhere. It had to be built in the grotto heavens. In addition, after building the divine palace, there had to be a large number of guards and God King powerhouses stationed for a long time. This series of matters had to be considered at length. In addition, there were also the rewards of the 20 clans and sects that had to be carefully considered. Not only must there be no omissions, but there must also be a distinction between the severity of the matter. In addition to these few urgent matters, the subsequent control of the 90 domain masters and the entire boundless heaven continent also required strict regulations. Ji Tianxing thought for a while and decided to discuss it with Nangong Buhua. However, just as he was about to look for Nangong Buhua came to him. The two of them entered a study room inside the god-slaying battleship. After Ji Tianxing sat down, Nangong Buhua began to report the situation. He took out 10 interspatial rings and placed them on the desk in front of Ji Tianxing. His tone was a little excited as he said, "Alliance Master, fortunately, we didn't let you down. These past few days, the 20 elders and deacons of our clan have been counting the spoils of war day and night. We've finally finished sorting them out. The spoils of war from the imperial tutor and his subordinates' interspatial rings are worth more than 300 trillion. They're all stored in these 4 interspatial rings. There are some extremely precious materials and divine weapons whose value is difficult to estimate, so we didn't include them. The other 6 spatial rings were filled with the resources and treasures that had been taken from the treasury. Although many of the resources and treasures in the treasury have been taken away in advance, it's less than we expected. However, after counting them, we can still estimate that their value is at least 700 trillion god stones." Nangong Buhua was the clan leader of an ancient clan and had seen a lot in his life. However, even with his status and experience, he had never seen such a huge amount of cultivation resources and wealth. Therefore, when he reported these numbers, his voice trembled a little. Of course, he was excited. Ji Tianxing looked at the 10 interspatial rings on the table. He wasn't excited or happy. Instead, he frowned. The resources and wealth in these 10 interspatial rings exceed 1 trillion, which is 1,000 trillion. It's reasonable to say that the Shura God Emperor has been plundering the entire continent's cultivation resources for the past 1,000 years. The treasury of the Divine Palace should have more than 700 trillion worth of resources. After thinking for a while, he suddenly thought of something and understood the reason. As far as he knew, when the imperial tutor and the Meng Shuai were in charge of the boundless heaven continent, they would organize a batch of cultivation resources every 50 years and send them to the depths of the void outside the realm for the Shura God Emperor to use. The Shura God Emperor and the other 4 gods did this. They spent an endless amount of cultivation resources to study the mystery of the grey fog. The last time the powerhouses under the Shura God Emperor returned to the boundless heaven continent to transport cultivation resources was 40 years ago. In other words, the 700 trillion worth of cultivation resources stored in the treasury of the Shura Divine Palace were most likely collected in the past 40 years. Thinking of this, he was relieved. At the same time, Ji Tianxing was also shocked. The people of the entire boundless heaven continent were enslaved by the Shura God Emperor and forced to plunder cultivation resources. In just 40 years, they were able to plunder 700 trillion worth of resources and treasures. This amount was too shocking. From this, it could be seen how rich the boundless heaven continent was and how vast the cultivation resources were. Fortunately, the cultivation resources of the divine world were even more plentiful and almost endless. Only then could it withstand the greed of the 5 god emperors for the past 1,000 years. If it were the dragon realm, the cultivation resources would be far inferior to the divine world. They would probably be emptied out. At this time, Nangong Buhua lowered his voice and said, "Alliance Master, now that the war has just ended and the news has just spread, the entire boundless heaven continent is in a state of shock and celebration. With these cultivation resources worth 1,000 trillion, you can recruit soldiers and horses, recruit talents, and absorb millions of soldiers. With millions of soldiers, you can firmly control the entire boundless heaven continent and be able to rest easy." Everyone knew that the boundless heaven continent had 100 regions. It was simply too vast. It was difficult for Ji Tianxing and the people of the Rebel Alliance to manage the entire continent, let alone take care of everything. Only by recruiting talents, like the Shura God Emperor, and gathering millions of soldiers under his command, could he completely control the boundless heaven continent. Ji Tianxing nodded and said, "This is feasible, but there's no rush. Wait until the situation stabilizes and then slowly implement it. After all, the leaders of the entire boundless heaven continent have all sworn to surrender and are completely loyal to me. There's nothing to worry about in the short term. Now, the most important thing is to set up a divine palace as the highest ruling place and establish authority. I've thought about it, but I haven't thought of which grotto heaven to set it up in." Nangong Buhua frowned and thought for a moment before coming up with an idea. "Alliance Master, weren't there a few clans who were loyal to the Imperial Tutor and fought with the Imperial Tutor? Now that the main forces of those clans have been destroyed by us, their grotto mansions are only left with some old and weak people. We can take back their grotto mansions and you can choose a grotto heaven to build your divine palace.